Chapter 60. Why is that? Han Nanzu was startled and asked doubtfully. Lu Qin did not answer him immediately. Instead, he raised his head and called out to He Gang and Exin, who were climbing the stone wall not far away, "You two come down first." He Gang and Exin looked back and were also a little surprised, but they quickly followed the stone wall down. Walking to Lu Qin, Exin rushed to ask, "Brother Lu, we are picking dusk fog flowers, why did you call us down?" Lu Qin said, "Don't pick them first, we'd better leave this place immediately." He Gang and Exin were both taken aback, their faces revealing a stunned expression. Han Nanzu frowned as he gazed at Lu Qin and said, "Brother Lu, what exactly has happened?" Lu Qin said, "I feel that there is something wrong with the surroundings, there may be more black jackals coming." He Gang immediately sneered and said disapprovingly, "It's just a kind of inferior demon beast, what's there to be afraid of?" Lu Qin raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at He Gang with a meaningful look. When He Gang was looked at by him, he suddenly recalled that when he encountered the group of black jackals earlier, his performance was a little embarrassing. For a moment, he felt a little embarrassed and said angrily, "What are you looking at? When we encountered the group of black jackals earlier, we were only unprepared. Once we faced them head-on, who would be afraid of those beasts? I can easily defeat them." Enough. A light shout rang out. It was Han Nanzu who stopped He Gang in time. However, at the same time, there was a trace of displeasure on his face as he said, "Brother Lu, these dusk mist flowers are very important to us. Moreover, we've also fought against those black jackals earlier. I believe you've seen for yourself that there's no problem." Lu Qin sighed and said, "In this mountain forest, black jackals are in groups and the number of dogs varies. There are only a few dogs in a small group, and there may be hundreds of dogs in a large group. If a large group of wild dogs were to come and gang up on you, it would be quite dangerous." Han Nanzu was silent, and there was some hesitation between his eyebrows. But Exin looked back at the stone wall beside the waterfall and said, "Martial uncle, we have only picked a few dusk fog flowers, there are still many more up there." Han Nanzu looked back and found that there were indeed more than half of the dusk fog flowers on the stone wall that had not been picked. At this moment they were slightly trembling in the moist wind, looking particularly beautiful. He hesitated for a moment, thinking in his mind about the use of the dusk fog flowers after bringing them back, and then he said decisively, "Continue picking. Quickly. Once we have picked all these dusk flowers we will leaving immediately." Okay. He Gang and Exin agreed at the same time. As soon as he finished speaking, Exin immediately turned around and left. He Gang glared at Lu Qin with a bit of disdain, then turned around and strode towards the stone wall. Lu Qin looked at his back and shook his head slightly, then said to Han Nanzu, "In that case I have promised the three of you to find this dusk fog flower, including the two-striped dusk fog flower. Now that I have done it, there is no need for me to stay here any longer. I will take my leave first." After saying this he reached out to Han Nanzu and cupped his hands, then turned around and left. Han Nanzu looked at his back and wanted to say something, but then hesitated. After taking a deep breath he turned around and walked towards the stone wall, ready to help He Gang and Exin. Lu Qin strode away from the mountain stream, walked to the edge of the stone cliff, found a high ground to jump on and looked around. He saw that the Black Armor Mountain was densely forested, and there was a murderous atmosphere. Further away in the forest, there were vague black shadows leaping up and down. He didn't know how many there were in the weeds, but he could vaguely see that the black shadows were moving in his direction, and their speed was not slow. Lu Qin's face slightly changed. He looked at the mountain stream under his feet, snorted softly, then turned around and strode away. After walking swiftly for over 300 m, Lu Qin suddenly heard a wave of enraged roars and curses resounding from afar in the forest behind him. But because it was far away those voices couldn't be heard clearly. However, there were many miserable barks of wild dogs mixed within, and it was extremely clear. At the same time, strange whooshing sounds also sounded from the forest behind him. It seemed that some of the black shadows were also chasing him. Lu Qin's face darkened and he cursed in a low voice, "The dog's nose is so sensitive." Standing in the same place and pondering for a moment, Lu Qin looked at the surrounding forest again, and then suddenly jumped on a tall tree. His movements were as nimble as a monkey's, and he climbed up the tree in no time. Then, when he reached a tree branch that was several feet above the ground, he suddenly used all his strength and jumped from one tree to another. He repeated this action more than a dozen times in a row. In this forest he was like a nimble monkey. Unbeknownst to anyone he leaped from branch to branch, leaped over 100 feet in the air, and then climbed to the densest branch at least 100 feet above the ground and quietly hid there. Not long after, he suddenly heard a sharp bark, and a large group of black shadows suddenly appeared in the forest. It was a large pack of dozens of black jackals. These ferocious wild dogs roared, as if they wanted to tear apart all the creatures in front of them. But when they chased all the way to the place where Lu Chen had climbed the tree, all the wild dogs seemed to have lost their target. They circled around in place at a loss for what to do. The barking of the dogs was still sharp and ear-piercing, and the anger and ferocity in it chilled one's heart. But even though all the dogs were desperately sniffing in the nearby forest, and even expanding their range to more than a dozen feet away, they still found nothing. Lu Chen, who was hiding in the tree, held his breath and looked down through the gaps in the leaves. He saw a few black jackals had even run to the tree he was hiding in and searched, but they still couldn't smell anything. They looked very irritated and annoyed. Lu Chen looked coldly at the wild dogs on the ground below and did not move. Demonic beasts like black jackals were born with a fierce temperament and were the most vengeful. If these beasts found him on this tree, even if they could not climb trees, they would surround this tree in this forest. They would not stop until their prey was killed. In his memory, a long time ago when he was still young, he had wandered around the Black Armor Mountain for a period of time. He once saw a large group of black jackals surround a bear on a tree for 7 days and 7 nights. In the end, the bear couldn't hold on any longer and was divided up by the black jackals. Lu Chen shook his head slightly and shook off the bad memories in his mind. Then he leaned against the tree trunk and prepared to wait for the sky to turn dark. Below, for some reason, the black jackals seemed unwilling to give up. Just like that, they searched back and forth in the forest. Even further away, the shouts and shouts of shock and anger, as well as the sounds of swords clashing and killing, gradually grew louder. Lu Chen glanced in the direction of the mountain stream. After a moment, he lowered his eyes expressionlessly. After an unknown period of time, the sounds of fighting gradually quieted down. Only the screams of the black jackals became more and more mournful. A gust of wind blew gently, and the leaves on the branches of the trees began to shake. It was a little cold. Lu Chen slowly opened his eyes and felt that it was dark in front of him. At this time it was already dark. Chapter 61. The familiar night fell on this mountain, the darkness spreading like a tide. Only the moonlight on the horizon shone down a little. The black jackals below had disappeared, perhaps because they could not find any prey. They had no choice but to retreat. At this time, the forest was quiet, only 1 or 2 low cries of insects could be heard from some unknown weeds. Lu Chen glanced in the direction of the mountain stream. At this time, it had long since quieted down, and there was no longer any movement. Lu Chen was expressionless, his face hidden among the branches and leaves looked exceptionally cold, completely different from his usual gentle expression in front of others. In the dim light, his eyes looked especially bright, like a silent beast hiding in the night. The forest under the night was quiet and cold. After a while, suddenly a figure rushed out of the darkness, staggering and running desperately, not caring even if the thorns in the forest hung on her clothes. Then, in the distance behind the figure, a few barks suddenly sounded, as if the appearance of the black figure had alarmed something, and then there was a terrible noisy roar surging over here again. The black figure heard the shrill cries behind her, her body trembled, ran faster and faster, all the way to the tree where Lu Chen was. As she got closer, Lu Chen looked down from the tree and suddenly frowned. The person was slender and pretty, but her face was full of fear. It was Exen. This young girl's face was full of panic and even a little despair, as if she was running forward desperately out of the desire to survive. No one knew how she survived alone in the mountain stream during the day. Lu Chen frowned, turned his head to look at the darkness in the distance, listening carefully to the distance where the barks came from. After a moment of hesitation, he stretched out his palm and pressed the tree trunk, quietly sliding down from the tree. As soon as his feet landed on the ground, the feeling was completely different from when he was on the tree. Behind him was a deep darkness, but in the deep shadows, it seemed that a large group of terrible monsters would rush out at any time and tear him to pieces. Without hesitation, Lu Chen turned and ran forward. In this forest, his figure was fast and abnormally agile, looking like a monster, far better than Exin, who was running desperately in front of him. In just a few leaps and bounds, he had caught up to the fleeing woman. Lu Chen grabbed Exin's arm from behind. Exin's entire body shook violently, and she suddenly let out a shrill cry. Her voice sounded as if her heart was being torn apart, and with despair and a bit of madness on the verge of death, she turned around and slashed with her sword. The sound of the sword cutting through the air was sharp, It could be seen that Exan used all her strength. Lu Qin dodged to the side, avoiding the sword, at the same time said in a low voice, "It's me, Lu Qin." Exan's sword slashed empty air, her body was brought forward 2 steps, and just as she was about to fight again she suddenly heard this sentence. Her body suddenly trembled, her eyes revealed a look of disbelief, looked at Lu Qin, and then her lips flattened as if she was about to cry, said, "Brother Lu, my martial uncle and senior brother, they—" Lu Qin directly interrupted her crying, grabbed Exan's hand, and ran forward. At the same time he hurriedly said, "Don't talk nonsense. Let's run for our lives first." Exan was pulled by him and she couldn't help but follow him. But after running for a while, Exan suddenly realized that something was wrong. Lu Qin didn't bring her along the mountain path they came from. Instead, he rushed directly into the dense forest in another direction. There were thorns and weeds everywhere, there was no path at all, and it was extremely difficult to run. After running for a short distance, Exan felt that not only were her clothes torn a few times, but there were also 4 or 5 wounds on her body. "Are we going the wrong way?" Exan shouted in panic. Lu Qin did not look back, just pulled her forward and said at the same time, "Yes, the wild dogs will be here in the blink of an eye. Running along the original path is courting death." Exan's mind was in a mess, but she could feel Lu Qin's hand holding her steady and strong, making her subconsciously run with Lu Qin. And in this short time, in the darkness behind them, the terrible barking of the wild dogs had become much clearer. Obviously the black jackals were rushing over here. The 2 of them fled through the thistles and thorns that were almost impenetrable. In just a short while, Exan felt as if she was being sliced apart by 1,000 cuts. Her entire body was pierced, torn, and even bleeding by the sharp thorns. Just when she was at a loss of what to do, all of a sudden, her feet slipped. In front of the 2 of them, there was suddenly a downhill slope, and the slope was very steep. Exan let out a scream, but before she could react, Lu Qin had already grabbed her wrist and dragged her down the hill. They instantly became 2 rolling gourds rolling down the hill. In the darkness, the roar of the wild dogs broke through the air and reached the hillside in the blink of an eye. There was a fishy smell in the air, but Exan didn't have time to think about it. She had completely lost control of her body and kept rolling around. She didn't know how many rocks and hardwood she hit in the middle, but she was covered in cuts and bruises. She only felt that the whole world was spinning, and strange stars kept flashing in front of her eyes. Her body seemed to no longer belong to her and was about to fall apart. There was only a blank space in her mind. The only remaining thought was probably, "Am I really going to die in this wilderness?" She didn't know when, but the rolling speed suddenly slowed down. After rolling for a distance, it finally stopped. Exan was in a daze for a while. She stood up, but her body suddenly tilted and fell to the side. After trying several times, she barely managed to maintain her balance and stood on the same spot. She gasped for breath and looked around. She saw that she was at the bottom of the hill. The surroundings were overgrown with weeds, but there were no tall trees. Moreover, there was the sound of water coming from somewhere nearby. Woof woof. Roar. A wave of mournful barking came again. Exan's body trembled and she looked back. In the dark night, with the help of the weak moonlight, she could see black shadows jumping on the hillside. It was the ferocious black jackals chasing after them like maggots. A hand reached out from the shadows again. Lu Qin appeared beside her and grabbed Exan's arm, running forward with large strides. "Hold your breath," he shouted loudly. Exan was stunned and said, "What?" Before she finished speaking, she suddenly felt her body become light. It was Lu Qin who had jumped out with her. When they flew over the grass in front of them, the entire terrain suddenly opened up. There was no land under their feet, but a rapid river in the mountains. There was a loud sound and water splashed everywhere. The 2 of them fell directly into the rapid river and disappeared in an instant. Chapter 62. The rapid river instantly drowned the 2 of them. A bone-piercing chill surged over, like a knife piercing into their flesh. Exan struggled with all her might, but her body was involuntarily swept forward by the current. She was like a piece of withered leaf in the water, constantly bumping into the hard rocks at the bottom of the river, and at the same time she could not breathe. She became more and more panicked, only feeling that everything in front of her was pitch black. There was only endless terrifying torrents in front of her, as if the next moment she could fall into a bottomless dark abyss. She could not help but cry out loudly, but before she could cry out, the moment she opened her mouth, the cold river water poured into her mouth, immediately suppressing all sounds. She choked on a large mouthful of water, violently coughing, at the same time her body was even more panicked, like a stiff rolling log in the water rampaging about. But at this time an arm stretched out from the side, hugging her body from behind. EXN was like a drowning person grabbing onto the last straw, her entire body leaned over, at the same time as she violently coughed, her hands tightly grabbing onto that arm. "Don't move." A low voice sounded in her ear, another body leaned over in the water, hugging her, letting her head out of the water so she could breathe, while floating down with the current. EXN greedily took in large mouthfuls of air, and then gradually became clear-headed and calmed down. She no longer moved casually and just nestled in the arms of the strange man. In this mournful and austere night, in this desolate and uninhabited wilderness, she drifted along with the flow. For a moment she seemed to have thought of something. She turned around and looked at the direction she came from. In the depths of the darkness at the foot of the hill, she could vaguely see a group of ferocious figures squeezing on the riverbank, letting out angry and violent roars. The current was very fast, but Lu Chen's swimming skills seemed to be quite good. Even with a burden like EXN, he was still able to swim with ease in the river. At the same time, the rapid current carried the two of them away from the hillside, all the way down, disappearing into the distance in this deep night. But looking at that direction, they were drifting further and further away from the path they came from, all the way into an even darker mountain range. After an unknown period of time, the river gradually calmed down, at the same time the surface of the water widened. The wild cries of those black jackals were long gone, only the darkness between the heavens and the earth remained the same. EXN felt Lu Chen start to paddle with his arms, bringing her upstream. At this moment, after several consecutive shocks and back and forth from the gates of hell, she felt extremely exhausted, but there was still a string in her mind that was tightly wound. As long as the night did not subside, as long as she was still in this terrifying wilderness of the land of confusion, she would feel a kind of fear from the bottom of her heart, and did not dare to sleep. After a while Lu Chen and brought EXN to the side of the river and they walked. Splash. There was a clear sound, that was the sound of water splashing down from their bodies. The two of them were already completely drenched. Lu Chen did not seem to feel anything, but when EXN stood on the riverbank and was blown by the night wind, she immediately felt a bone-chilling cold, and could not help but shiver a few times. Lu Chen glanced at her, walked to EXN's side and said, "Can you still hold on?" EXN forced a smile and said, "I'm fine." After saying this, she suddenly realized that because her clothes were completely drenched, they were tightly clinging to her body, revealing all the exquisite curves of her body, making her look especially alluring. EXN felt her face suddenly heat up, and she subconsciously let out an "ah," and reached out to cover her body. Who knew that as soon as she raised her hand, an indescribably intense pain suddenly came from her left arm. EXN only felt her vision go black and she staggered, almost falling to the ground, and her mouth also let out a painful groan. Lu Chen supported her, a little surprised, and asked, "What's wrong?" EXN was in so much pain that even her voice sounded a little shaky, and she said with a trembling voice, "My hand, my left hand." Lu Chen looked over and reached out to support her arm for a moment, and then immediately frowned and said, "It's broken." EXN bit her lip, lightly gasping for breath. In her mind, the scene of her escape just now replayed in her mind, but she found that she could not remember where exactly it was that broke her arm. Perhaps it was because she was too nervous and excited, or because she had suffered too many injuries on the way, so she did not immediately notice that her arm was broken. Lu Chen looked around and after a moment of silence said, "Sit down first and rest for a while." EXN used her right hand to support her left arm, found a stone on the river bank and sat down, while Lu Chen walked to a place a little further away, where there were a few trees. He fiddled there for a while and after a moment came back with a branch about 2 fingers wide. At the moment he was holding a black dagger in his hand and it looked quite sharp. EXN watched him cut off all the branches and leaves, leaving only a round wooden trunk, and then he gestured to her arm. "Do you have medicine on you?" Lu Chen asked EXN. EXN shook her head and said in a low voice, "I only have some medicine to stop bleeding and no medicine to set bones." Lu Chen nodded and didn't say anything else. He tore off a few pieces of cloth from his clothes, and then straightened EXN's arm so that the broken bones were in place and tied her arm to the tree trunk. "Let's do this for now. When the sun rises we'll look around to see if there are any suitable herbs for you to apply," Lu Chen said calmly. In the process of tying her arm, it was naturally unavoidable to touch the broken bones, and EXN suffered a lot. But at least she knew that Lu Chen was doing this for her own good, and so she endured the pain, but her eyes were already filled with tears, and her face was incomparably pale. When Lu Chen was finally done, EXN let out a long sigh of relief, and then timidly said, "Thank you very much, Brother Lu." Lu Chen looked at her and said, "It's very dangerous here in the disorienting lands at night, and we can't easily light a fire. Otherwise it'll easily attract troublesome and powerful demonic beasts. We can only wait like this until the sun rises. Can you still hold on?" EXN gritted her teeth. Although she felt a sharp pain in her arm and waves of cold constantly invaded her skin, she still nodded and said, "I can." Lu Chen grunted and walked to a spot a few feet away from EXN, and directly lay down on the ground saying, "Then let's rest and wait for the sun to rise." EXN sat there in a daze for a while. Although she was extremely tired, she didn't know why, but she didn't feel the slightest bit sleepy. Looking at the deep night sky between the mountains and the dark river not far away, she suddenly felt like crying. It was at this moment that Lu Chen's voice suddenly sounded from beside her. "That's right, where are your two companions? How are they?" Chapter 63. They. In the dark of the night, although EXN was sitting not far away, her figure was somewhat blurry. At this moment, her voice sounded a little trembling and deep, as if Lu Chen's words had suddenly poked at a certain part of her heart. For a moment she didn't know what to say. "Did you encounter a pack of black jackals at the waterfall?" EXN slowly lowered her head. After a while she said, "Yes, after you left, not long after, a large group of black jackals suddenly rushed over. There were too many of them and I couldn't even count them all." Her breathing suddenly became a little hurried as if she was being stabbed by memories. She said in a low voice, "Martial uncle, senior martial brother and I fought in a hurry. Although we had our backs against the wall of the mountain, there were too many demonic beasts. After fighting for a long time, we still couldn't hold on. Uncle Master told us to split up and run. He said that one of us could escape." At this point her voice was choked with sobs. After a pause she continued, "Senior brother and I rushed out. In the middle I turned around and saw Uncle Master being pounced on by a large group of black jackals. In the blink of an eye, flesh and blood flew everywhere. I was terrified. Senior brother he pulled me and ran with all his might, but there were black jackals chasing after us. In the end, senior brother he and I had no choice but to split up and run for our lives. The last time I saw him there were more than 10 black jackals pouncing on him. Then they were blocked by the trees. I only heard a series of screams and wild dogs barking." In the darkness, Lu Chen was silent for a moment before saying, "What about you? Why were you the only one who escaped in the end?" EXN said in a daze, "I ran for a while and saw that I was about to be caught again. But at this moment, I suddenly remembered that before I went down the mountain, Master had given me a blinding talisman. So I climbed up a tree and used this talisman. The black jackals chased me nearby and couldn't find me." At this point EXN suddenly burst into tears and cried, "It's all my fault, it's all my fault. If I had thought of this earlier, martial uncle and senior brother might not have died." Lu Chen was silent and didn't say anything. He let EXN cry for a while. After her sobs calmed down a little, he said indifferently, "This isn't your fault. And even if you used this talisman in advance, when the black jackals were right in front of you, with the keen senses of those demon beasts, you still wouldn't be able to escape." EXN's body trembled as she whispered, "Really?" "Yes." Lu Chen responded, then turned over and said, "It's getting late, hurry up and sleep. We might have to climb mountains and wade rivers for the whole day tomorrow. If you don't sleep, your body won't be able to take it." EXN's lips moved slightly. After a moment she still slowly lay down on the grass by the river bank. Her mind was in a mess, and her heart was filled with regret and fear. She thought that she wouldn't be able to fall asleep no matter what, but who knew that as she lay down she would unknowingly close her eyes and fall asleep. The morning sun fell on the riverbank, shining on the sleeping woman's face. Although her face was still a little pale and the ends of her hair were messy, a strand of beautiful hair still hung down from her temples and slid down to her nose, bringing with it a bit of languid beauty. Her slender and long eyelashes trembled a few times in the golden brilliance, and then EXN slowly opened her eyes. For a moment she seemed to still be in the warm home of her memories. Her kind master and close senior and junior sisters were still by her side. Someone was smiling and saying something to her, and when she was full of joy and wanted to sit up and answer, a sudden pain came from her left arm, waking her up from the illusion. Hiss! EXN sucked in a breath of cold air and bit her lips. This time the pain was so severe that she almost cried out. At the same time, a voice came from not far away. Be careful, don't make the injured bone crooked, otherwise you'll suffer again. EXN panted a few times and didn't dare to move her left arm. She sat up straight and looked to the side. She saw that Lu Qin had already woken up and was walking over from the other side of the forest. He was holding a lot of things in his hands. It looked like some random weeds that EXN didn't recognize, and in the middle there were some strange dark brown things. Lu Qin walked to EXN's side and squatted down to put the things in his hands to the side. Then he grabbed EXN's left arm and examined it. He nodded and said to her, "I'll help you apply some medicine now. It should heal faster, but there will be some pain. Endure it yourself." When EXN heard the word pain, her heart skipped a beat. She was a little afraid, but looking at Lu Chen's calm face, she didn't know why she couldn't say no for a moment. Moreover, no matter how she looked at it, this man was doing it for her own good. So, after hesitating for a moment, she still slowly nodded. Lu Chen gently untied the wooden stick from her arm and then tore her sleeve. On her white wrist, the area around the broken arm was already red and swollen. Lu Chen frowned and lowered his head to gather the herbs he had picked and mashed them together, including the strange black things. EXN glanced at his hands. Suddenly, her eyes straightened and she saw that the black things were actually some strange insect eggs that she couldn't name. They were black and fat and looked very disgusting. EXN was shocked and suddenly felt nauseous. She almost vomited and cried out, What are these things? What do you want to do with them?" "The larvae of the golden-winged bee," Lu Chen glanced at her and said faintly, "Don't talk nonsense. This is good stuff. It can at least speed up the recovery of your broken arm by several times. You're lucky to be able to find it here." EXN was stunned and speechless. She wanted to say something, but she swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. It was just that she had never seen these disgusting things before. When she saw that Lu Chen had actually mashed the insect eggs together with the herbs, she suddenly couldn't stand it. She quickly turned her face away and took a few deep breaths before she slowly recovered. Not long after, EXN suddenly felt a cool sensation on her arm. Then Lu Chen smeared a layer of sticky stuff on the wound of her broken arm. EXN didn't dare to look at the wound. After a while, she felt that Lu Chen first wrapped it with a cloth and then tied her arm to the wooden stick again. "It's done." Lu Chen stood up and said to her, "As long as there are no accidents, he should be fine in about 7 or 8 days. Let's get up and continue our journey." EXN gritted her teeth and stood up. She forced herself not to look at her left arm and said, "Where are we going?" Lu Chen said, "I don't know. Let me see the direction and terrain first." EXN was taken aback and said, "Aren't you a guide? You should be very familiar with the Black Armor Mountain, right?" Lu Chen looked at the woman snappily and said, "Of course I'm familiar with the vicinity of the Black Armor Mountain. But even if I'm a guide, I can't jump into the torrent to explore the terrain, right? I've never been to this area." EXN was speechless. At the same time, she also felt that she had said something wrong. If it wasn't for saving her, perhaps he actually didn't need to jump into the river last night. Thinking of this, her cheeks became a little hot. She subconsciously turned her head away and looked elsewhere. Who knew that as she turned her gaze, EXN suddenly saw a pair of ferocious eyes looking at them from behind a dense thicket of grass in front of them. There was a trace of viciousness in that fierce gaze, almost no different from that of a demon beast, causing EXN to jump in fright. She suddenly took a step back and pointed in that direction, crying out involuntarily, "There's someone over there." Chapter 64. "What?" Lu Chen was taken aback. He turned around and asked EXN. EXN hurriedly pointed at the bushes and said anxiously, I just saw something in the bushes." Before she finished speaking, EXN's voice suddenly stopped. She looked in that direction with a trace of surprise. She saw that the bushes were still the same, but she didn't see the pair of fierce eyes that she just saw. Lu Chen looked in the direction that EXN pointed. He looked at the bushes and frowned slightly. He then walked over. EXN didn't know why, but she suddenly felt nervous. She also followed behind him, and at the same time, her eyes kept looking left and right. The two walked to the edge of the bushes. They saw that the bushes were lush, about a person's knee height. But at the moment, the bushes were empty. It was obviously impossible for someone to hide inside. Lu Chen pondered for a moment. He broke a branch from the side and patted the nearby bushes for a while. He only saw a few flying insects, but he still didn't see the figure that EXN said. Lu Chen looked back at EXN. EXN's cheeks were slightly red. For a moment she was not very confident. She thought, could it be that I was too tired yesterday so my mind is not very clear now? What I saw just now, was it just an illusion? Lu Chen walked back to her side and didn't say much. He just calmly said, "Since there is nothing, then let's hurry." "Okay." Exin responded with some embarrassment. Lu Chen nodded and walked forward. Exin looked at the bushes again. She saw that the surroundings were quiet, as if there was really nothing. But she carefully thought about it. She remembered that the pair of fierce and vicious eyes in the bushes was particularly clear. She couldn't help but shiver. With such a delay, Lu Chen had already walked a distance. He then noticed something and turned around to call out to Exin. Exin quickly responded. She shook off the inexplicable thought in her mind and quickly chased after Lu Chen. As the two of them gradually walked further away, a light breeze suddenly blew from the surface of the river, passing through the silent depths of the wild grass. The verdant leaves of the grass and trees trembled slightly like waves, faintly making out a blurry shadow, flashing past the grass and leaves in the distance. Lu Chen didn't go up the river with Exin. Instead they went downstream. After walking for a while, Exin noticed this and asked Lu Chen about it. Lu Chen's answer was also very straightforward. It was easier to go downstream. If they went upstream they would have to enter several mountain ranges including the Black Armor Mountain. There were all kinds of demon beasts and unknown dangers in the mountains. It was very troublesome. Even if they found the way back to the Black Armor Mountain, it was unlikely that they could go back the way they came. Because demon beasts like black jackals were very vengeful, the large group of ferocious wild dogs was probably still waiting in the mountains. As long as the direction was right, they could also get out of the chaotic land by going downstream, and there would be less danger on the way. In the current situation, Exin didn't have much of a mind of her own. Moreover, after last night's escape, she had developed a lot of trust in Lu Chen, who she had only known for a few days. After all, he saved her life and healed her injuries. Even if he wanted to harm her, he would have done what he should have done last night. Therefore, she quickly accepted this reality and obediently followed Lu Chen downstream. It was a sunny day in late autumn. The river was calm and clear, and the hills on both sides of the river were undulating. It looked like a painting, not at all like the legendary land of confusion that was known to be filled with countless dangers and dangers. After walking for about half an hour they walked along the river into a valley. Suddenly they saw a colorful scene in front of them. Taking a closer look, it turned out to be a piece of land with a radius of several acres, covered with all kinds of colorful strange flowers. The flowers were delicate and beautiful, and each flower was extremely large. The smallest one seemed to be the size of a wash basin. Blooming under the sun, it was like a strange land of rainbows that fell into the human world. Exin opened her eyes wide and couldn't help exclaiming, "Ah, it's so beautiful here. So many beautiful flowers." Before she could finish her words, she suddenly heard Lu Chen's faint voice beside her. "If you don't want to die, then stay further away from that side." Exin turned her head back in shock, her mouth half agape. "Why?" Lu Chen didn't even turn his head back as he walked forward. His body neared the riverside and distanced himself from the cluster of flowers. At the same time he said, "This is a bloodthirsty demon flower. Usually, it uses its flowers to lure living creatures. As long as there's a prey that comes near, countless sharp thorns will break out from the ground and pull the prey back. At the same time the thorns have a strange poison. It's not fatal but it can make the prey's entire body weak and unable to move. After it's dragged back to the cluster of flowers, it will turn into a bloody pulp." His words were said calmly but Exin was dumbstruck. Her face turned pale and revealed a look of fear. When she looked at the beautiful cluster of flowers again, she couldn't help but shiver and said in a low voice, Why are there so many monsters here?" Lu Chen glanced at her and shook his head without saying a word. He turned and continued to walk forward. Exin was a little discouraged. She sighed and followed him. The two of them walked along the river and bypassed the seemingly beautiful land of demonic flowers. After walking for a while and seeing that they were about to walk out of the valley where the bloodthirsty demonic flowers were hidden, they suddenly heard a low whine coming from the side. It sounded a little mournful, and it was somewhat similar to the cry of the black jackal yesterday. Exin's first reaction was that her hair stood on end. She almost jumped up. Yesterday she was almost killed by those terrible black jackals, so she was almost allergic to this kind of terrible sound. However, in comparison, Lu Chen was much calmer. He first grabbed Exin, who was about to rush forward to escape, and pulled her to his side. At the same time, he frowned and looked to the side of the valley exit. Exin was still in a state of shock, but she felt at ease when she felt Lu Chen's hand beside her. She looked over and was stunned. There was no black jackal on the ground. No, there seemed to be a wild dog. It wasn't big and it looked like half a puppy at most. The fur on its body was black, but it was lighter than the black jackal demonic beasts from yesterday. It seemed a little different. Especially on its back, from the back of its head and neck down to its back, there was a long and narrow white fur band. It was very clear, showing that this puppy was not a black jackal. After EXN looked carefully for a while, she saw even more strangeness. The puppy was lying on the ground, unable to move. It could only cry out mournfully, looking especially pitiful and helpless. One of its legs was dragging behind it. Unlike the other 3 legs, it seemed to be broken. The puppy lay there with a blank look in its eyes as if it was about to run out of oil. Even its sorrowful cries gradually became softer. It seemed that if no one helped it, it would die here in a short while. It looked so pitiful. EXN couldn't help but say. When Lu Qin heard her words, he quickly frowned and looked at the woman indifferently. Chapter 65. EXN suddenly felt a little guilty when he suddenly looked at her like this. After hesitating for a moment, she softly asked with a trace of unconfidence, "Brother Lu, this puppy, could it be a powerful demonic beast that can harm our lives at any time?" Lu Qin glanced in that direction and said indifferently, "Such a small thing, of course it can't kill us." EXN let out a sigh of relief, as if her suspended heart had finally been put down. "Then let's save it, okay?" Lu Qin snorted and said, "You were chased half to death by a pack of black jackals yesterday, how can you be so merciful today?" EXN was startled and said, "Is this puppy also a black jackal? When I saw it just now I thought it wasn't. It really isn't a purebred black jackal demonic beast." Lu Qin interrupted EXIN's words and said, "This is a hybrid between a mountain snow wolf and a black jackal. It is rare for it to survive and grow up. Even if you save it, it would be a waste." EXN was stunned and said, "Why?" Lu Qin wanted to say something but stopped. For some reason, his expression suddenly became gloomy, as if he was a little unhappy. Even his voice had a rare trace of impatience as he said, "In short, it still has the blood of a black jackal. Do you want to save it?" EXIN was shouted at by him and immediately shrank back. After a while, she timidly said, "I'll listen to you." Lu Qin snorted and turned to leave. EXIN sighed softly and followed. From time to time, the puppy's sorrowful cries could be heard from behind her. EXN could not bear to see it, but reason told her that Lu Qin's method might be the right choice, so she resisted the urge to look back. The 2 of them walked all the way out of the river valley, and the puppy finally disappeared from their line of sight. At the same time, the river made a big turn here and continued flowing in another direction. Lu Qin stopped in his tracks. He raised his head and looked around. He then looked up at the sky as if he was trying to figure out the direction and the terrain. EXN hesitated as she waited, but she couldn't help but take advantage of this opportunity to sneak a few steps towards the river valley. She stuck her head out and looked at the place where Lu Qin had been. However, with this glance, EXN suddenly let out a soft cry. Then she used her uninjured hand to cover her mouth, her eyes filled with shock. Lu Qin immediately noticed EXIN's unusual behavior and turned around to look at her. Then he frowned. In the distance, near the broken leg of the puppy, a large yellow leopard suddenly appeared. It bared its sharp fangs and slowly approached the puppy. At the same time, its eyes were filled with greed. The puppy let out a mournful cry as if sensing the impending disaster, desperately struggling to shrink back. However, one of its broken legs was dragging on the ground, and no matter how hard it tried to crawl away, it was only a feeble struggle before death. The yellow leopard clearly saw through the puppy's weakness. But as a monster it still had some vigilance. It first looked around to see if there were any enemies nearby. At the same time, it was also very afraid of the bloodthirsty demon flowers, so it kept a long distance. The puppy was about 30 feet away from the bloodthirsty demon flowers. The yellow leopard looked at the flowers and seemed to determine that this distance was enough to not disturb the flowers. With a low growl, its body suddenly soared into the air and pounced towards the puppy. The puppy let out a mournful cry. In the distance, EXIN's body trembled. She couldn't help but close her eyes, not daring to look again. But at this moment, a black shadow suddenly flew out from nowhere, streaked across the air and directly smashed into the area between the puppy and the bloodthirsty demon flowers. Lu Qin looked over and his pupils suddenly constricted. He saw that the thing that was suddenly thrown out was a bloody piece of meat. There seemed to be a light breeze gently blowing past. In the vast empty space in the river valley, everything suddenly quietened down. Almost in that instant, the yellow leopard who was already in the air suddenly let out an angry roar. But the ground in front of him suddenly shook violently. Near that piece of meat, a boom sound was heard. Several thick vines full of thorns broke out from the ground and rushed out, wrapping around that piece of meat. But that piece of meat was too small and it did not move at all. The vines wiggled a few times and instantly seemed to sense something and turned in a different direction. This time it was towards the yellow leopard who had leapt into the air. The ferocity in the yellow leopard's eyes was no longer there. Right now it was filled with fear. How could it still care about that puppy? With a mournful cry, it landed on the ground and was about to run away with its tail between its legs. However, those extremely terrifying vines arrived with a loud bang. Their speed was fast, almost like lightning. Wherever they passed, sand and stones flew. Only a rumbling sound mixed with sharp howls could be heard. A moment later, amidst the yellow leopard's angry roar, it was actually caught by those vines just as it was about to run out of the boundary and then slowly dragged back. The yellow leopard screamed and screamed, struggling with all its might. However, the vines wrapped around it and not long after, countless of thorns pierced into the yellow leopard's flesh. Gradually its voice became lower and lower. Its struggling became smaller and smaller until it finally reached a state of limp helplessness. At this time, a black rope suddenly flew out. There was a sharp claw attached to the rope and it accurately landed on the yellow leopard's hind leg. Then it suddenly grabbed tightly and the sharp blade instantly cut open the yellow leopard's flesh. The yellow leopard let out a mournful cry as one of its hind legs was separated from its body. Strangely, the bloodthirsty demon flowers did not have any reaction to this. They continued to drag the yellow leopard, who was on its last breath, and continued to walk backwards. Not long after, they dragged it to the incomparably gorgeous flower field. After wriggling for a while, it once again became quiet. The rope that was holding the leopard's leg fell to the ground and also slowly retracted. At the same time, a figure walked out and unhappily spat. He grabbed the leopard's leg with one hand and the puppy with the broken leg with the other, then turned around and left. Under the sunlight, this person looked like an evil spirit that had just walked out of the Yellow Springs. His body was bent and his skin was dark and cracked. He was almost like a skeleton with only skin and bones. And on that terrifying face, 2 broken fangs protruded from the side of his mouth, making him look more like a beast than a human. As he left, this strange person seemed to think of something. He suddenly turned around and looked in the direction of the valley's exit. However, he saw that it was empty and there was no sign of anyone. He muttered something as if he was cursing something viciously. Then he grabbed the bloody leg and quickly disappeared into the valley. No one knew where he went. After a long time, Lu Qin and Exian's figures slowly appeared behind the stone wall of the valley's exit. Lu Qin's hand was tightly covering Exian's mouth. Exian's eyes were filled with shock, as if she could not understand what had just happened. On the other hand, Lu Qin's expression was rather cold. He looked coldly at the river valley as if he was thinking about something. After a while, he suddenly said in a low voice, "Barbarians?" Chapter 66. Exin was so shocked by what she had just seen that her heart was still pounding, so she did not hear Lu Chen's words clearly. She asked in a low voice, "Who are you talking about?" However, Lu Chen's hand was still covering her mouth, causing her words to sound muffled. Only then did Lu Chen realize that and let go of his hand. Exin heaved a sigh of relief. After taking a few breaths, she looked at the place where the bloodthirsty demon flower had been and could not help but turn pale. If Lu Chen hadn't stopped her, and if the 2 of them had walked up to the puppy with a broken leg and thrown that bloody piece of meat at it, Exin didn't even dare to imagine what the consequences would have been. "This place is too dangerous. Let's go," Exin said to Lu Chen in a low voice. At the same time, she swore to herself that she would never come to a place like this again. However, Lu Chen did not seem to have any intention of leaving immediately. He looked coldly in the direction that the mysterious black figure had disappeared in. It was a dense forest and no one knew where it led to. "Let's go and take a look." When she heard the first half of Lu Chen's words, Exin heaved a sigh of relief and a gratified expression appeared on her face. However, before the smile could fully appear on her pretty face, her expression froze again. What are we going to see?" she stuttered. Lu Chen did not speak and walked towards the forest in the valley. He looked calm, but when Exin looked at him from the side, she noticed that his eyes seemed to be exceptionally bright. There was even an icy coldness that she had never felt from this man before. It was as if a sharp blade was slowly being unsheathed, emitting the scent of blood. A barbarian who strayed from the group in the disorienting lands. A low voice seemed to come from his mouth. It sounded like he was talking to himself, but it also sounded like he was laughing coldly. Exin stood rooted to the ground. For a moment she was at a loss. From the bloody and violent scene just now, the mysterious black figure hiding in the dark was obviously very ferocious. It would be very dangerous to go and look for it rashly. However, she did not understand why Lu Qin, who had been very cautious most of the time, would suddenly act out of character and insist on finding trouble with the black figure. Wouldn't it be better to just leave this place? After all, neither of them were injured, right? She hesitated for a long time. When she looked up, she realized that Lu Qin had already walked far away. Seeing that he was about to reach the edge of the forest, Exen could not help but feel a little afraid. She didn't have much worldly experience, so she was a little afraid of the disorienting lands after last night's experience. Lu Qin was her most trustworthy backer at the moment. At that moment she couldn't help but call out, "Big brother Lu, wait for me." As she spoke, she jogged to catch up to him. Walking into the forest, Exen felt that the surrounding light had suddenly dimmed. The temperature was also slightly lower than outside. She guessed that it was because the forest was too dense. There were many short shrubs in the forest. Who knew how many years of fallen leaves had formed a thick layer on the ground? When she walked on it, she felt that it was soft under her feet. The air was filled with the smell of the leaves and rotten soil under her feet. It didn't take Lu Qin much effort to find a hidden path in the forest, and then he walked along it. The path was intermittent and strange. Sometimes it would suddenly disappear. However, no one knew what kind of strange ability Lu Qin had. Every time this happened, he would carefully observe the surroundings and find some traces in some inconspicuous corner. From there he would rediscover the path. Some of the traces were faint blood stains from the short leaves. Some were leaves that had just fallen. There were even some that were almost unrecognizable footprints on the withered leaves. However, Lu Qin still managed to find them one by one. Yexian followed behind Lu Qin. Her eyes were filled with shock and horror. Ever since she was young, she had embarked on the path of immortal cultivation. All she knew was cultivation techniques. At most, she would spar with her fellow disciples. She had never seen anything like this before. She looked at the back of the man in front of her and suddenly felt a sense of trepidation. If one day she became this man's prey, she would definitely have nowhere to run, right? She could vaguely sense that this man named Lu Qin seemed to exist on the other side of the cultivation world that she was familiar with. Before coming to the chaotic lands, she knew nothing about the things in that dark world. Lu Qin's movements were practiced and efficient. Sometimes, his movements were so sharp that Exin felt that there were some hidden traces. It was as if he knew the location beforehand and found it with incredible speed. Or perhaps, he seemed to be familiar with the habits of the black shadow in front of him. About an hour later, Lu Qin suddenly stopped in his tracks and stopped Exin. In front of them, outside the dense thicket, there was an open space about half an acre in size. A large boulder abruptly rose up to form a slope, and under the boulder was a cave entrance. The ground outside the cave was a mess. There were things that looked like garbage everywhere. There were charred stones, broken wooden sticks, and bones of different sizes. At a cursory glance, most of them were small animal bones. Huff, 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 a strange sound came from the cave. It sounded like heavy breathing. Not long after, a black shadow walked out. It was indeed the strange man who had appeared in the Valley of the Bloodthirsty Demon Flowers. Now that they were closer, Lu Qin and Exin could see more clearly than before. Soon they realized that this person wasn't young. Apart from the fact that he was all skin and bones, even his gait made him look like an old man who was out of breath. But even so, this strange man's ferociousness didn't diminish at all. When he walked out, he was still holding the bloody leopard's leg in his hand. He sat on a huge rock and opened his mouth to chew on it. Blood flowed down the corner of his mouth. He looked like a wild beast. Exin's body trembled. She felt a wave of nausea in her stomach. She almost vomited from this scene. Fortunately, she knew that this was not the time. She forced herself to bear with it. But she did not dare to look at this barbaric man drinking blood. She shrank her body back. Just as she was about to tell Lu Qin not to cause trouble and leave first, her body suddenly froze. Lu Qin had already vanished from her side at some point in time. Exin was shocked. She turned her head and looked around. After a while, she suddenly realized that Lu Qin's figure was already at the edge of the shrubs not far from the cave. He was right behind the strange man, and was slowly approaching. The straight line distance between the two seemed to be less than 10 feet. For a moment, Exin only felt that her heart was suddenly in her throat. She was so nervous that she even held her breath. Around the cave, it was even more silent. Only the strange man seemed to be unknowingly gnawing on flesh and blood like a wild beast. However, amidst this tranquility, a wave of miserable dog barks suddenly resounded from within the cave, and it broke the silence here. Chapter 67. Lu Qin, who had been slowly approaching, suddenly stopped in his tracks. Exin, who was lying in the bushes further away, felt a buzzing sound in her head and her mind went blank. Her heart was beating so fast that it felt like it was about to explode. On the other side of the cave, the strange man who was gnawing on the leopard's leg also stopped for a moment. He suddenly raised his head but did not turn around. Instead he roared, "Stupid dog, shut up." As he spoke, he fiercely bit down on the flesh on his hand and then cursed vaguely, "You're lucky today. You didn't catch the woman you wanted to catch, but a yellow leopard came to throw its life away. After I finish eating this leopard's leg, if I still can't catch anything, I'll eat you too." The barking in the cave slowly subsided. It was unknown whether it was because the little dog was frightened or because it was heavily injured and had no strength left. The strange man sneered. After eating a lot of meat, he seemed to be in better spirits. Although he still looked old and decrepit, the greedy and ferocious look in his eyes became more intense. He muttered to himself, "Damn it. If I had caught that woman today, I could have. What could I have done?" Suddenly, a cold voice came from behind him. The strange man was so shocked that he almost dropped the leopard's leg in his hand. He suddenly turned around and saw a man standing behind him. Moreover, the man's face was somewhat familiar. It was the man who had spied on him during the day. The strange man let out a ferocious roar. He jumped up and directly used the leopard's leg as a weapon to smash it towards Lu Qin. His momentum was like that of an enraged beast. However, his body had only jumped halfway when he suddenly felt a chill in his waist, followed by a burst of sharp pain. The strange man immediately let out a heart-wrenching scream. When he looked down, he saw that a black dagger had pierced into his waist at some point. His jump with all his strength just now had directly cut a shocking large wound on his back. Red blood instantly gushed out like a blood fountain, but it quickly weakened. It was as if the old and decrepit body had long lost its vitality. The strange man staggered backwards, his mouth constantly letting out angry roars. However, it seemed that his already weakened and decayed body could no longer bear such a heavy wound. Not long after, he fell heavily to the ground, gasping for breath and struggling. At the same time, he used an unimaginably vicious gaze to stare fiercely at the man who suddenly appeared. Exn ran over from the side, and when her eyes met the strange man's terrifying gaze, she was so scared that her face turned pale. She didn't dare to look at the beast-like man any longer, and ran to Lu Chen's side like a wisp of smoke. "Are you all right?" Lu Chen glanced at her and shook his head, and then he pointed at the ferocious man and said, "The trap in the river valley was supposed to harm us." Exion's heart skipped a beat. For a moment she did not know what to say. She only saw Lu Chen smile coldly. He slowly walked to the strange man's side with the black dagger in his hand and squatted down. The strange man's body subconsciously shrank back, but he still stared at Lu Chen with a fierce gaze. If looks could kill, Lu Chen would have been killed countless times by him. However, Lu Chen did not seem to feel anything. At most, he only showed a trace of disgust and said, "You better behave." The strange man's body and face were covered with blood, looking especially ferocious and terrifying. Hearing this, he laughed sinisterly and scolded, "Get lost, I will eat you." A mournful scream suddenly came out of his mouth again. Exan, who was standing not far away, was shocked. She turned to look, only to see Lu Chen's expressionless face, seemingly unmoved by the strange man's miserable state. In his hand, the black short sword had already pierced into the strange man's thigh, and with a twist, it tore a large hole in the man's leg. The strange man roared and screamed. He rolled around on the ground and screamed himself hoarse. Exan only felt her hair stand on end. At the same time, she could not bear it. She walked over and secretly pulled on Lu Chen's sleeve. She softly said, "Lu, brother Lu, don't be like this." Lu Chen turned back to look at her and suddenly said, "Do you know who he is?" Exan felt a little scared under his gaze. She did not know why, but at this moment, although she could feel that Lu Chen did not have any hostility towards her, she still felt a little afraid of him. She was even more afraid of Lu Chen than that ferocious strange man. She lowered her head and softly said, "I don't know. He is a barbarian." Lu Chen's voice sounded in her ear. His calm voice seemed to have a trace of coldness. Exan was shocked and said, "Barbarian? Didn't the barbarians retreat to the southern wilderness after they were defeated in the war 1,000 years ago?" Lu Qin glanced at the old barbarian who was still screaming miserably on the ground and said, "Most of the barbarian tribes have retreated, but the 1,000-year war was too intense. Even some of the passages and mountain ranges were destroyed by those powerful true sovereigns and true ones. So, there are still some barbarians left in the chaotic lands." This was the first time Exian heard of this. She was stunned for a long time before she said in surprise, "So there is such a thing. But I have never heard of the barbarian tribes in the chaotic lands." Lu Qin said, "The remaining barbarians mostly live in the form of tribes and live in the depths of the chaotic lands. They will not easily come to the outskirts. It is not strange that you do not know of them." Exian hesitated for a moment and said, "I heard that the deeper you go into the chaotic lands the more dangerous it gets. If that is the case, why don't the barbarians come to the outskirts? Isn't it better to live there?" Lu Qin said indifferently, "Because in the chaotic lands in the eyes of the barbarians, we human cultivators are more dangerous than the demonic beasts in the chaotic lands." Exian was stunned and subconsciously wanted to refute. In her impression, although there were good and bad people among all the cultivators she had met, there were rarely people like the Devil King who killed without blinking an eye. To be more precise, she had never seen such a cultivator in all her years of cultivation. But just as the words were about to leave her mouth, she suddenly saw the man in front of her and swallowed them back down. She lowered her head and said, "Don't they have their own tribes? Why is there only one person here? And why did he come to the outskirts where there are many human cultivators?" The depths of the chaotic lands are extremely dangerous. Although the barbarians have gathered into tribes, it is not easy for them to survive. So for many years they have developed a custom. The elders of the tribe who are old and weak and can no longer hunt in the central regions of the chaotic lands have to leave the tribe and fend for themselves. Exian slowly opened her mouth. She felt a chill run down her spine and a patch of icy white faintly appeared in front of her eyes. It was as if the beautiful world in front of her had suddenly been flipped upside down, revealing a cruel and cold side. Lu Qin's calm voice continued, "This should be the case for these barbarians. Because they are old and weak, they cannot stay in the central regions of the chaotic lands where the demonic beasts are extremely dangerous. They can only slowly migrate to the outskirts and settle down in this river valley in the outskirts. They wait for their deaths while harming others." As Lu Qin spoke, he glanced at Exian and saw the expression on her face. He suddenly said, "You heard it just now, right? That trap was meant to capture you. Do you want to know what will happen to you if he captures you alive?" Exian looked at him blankly. Looking at Lu Qin's calm yet deep eyes, she suddenly felt a bone-piercing cold, as if she had fallen into an icehouse. Chapter 68. What will happen? Exian asked in a low voice. Lu Qin looked at her face and slowly said, "If you fall into a trap and are captured alive without any ability to fight back, he will first rape you, then chop your body into pieces and slowly eat them." He pointed at the bloody leopard's leg on the ground and expressionlessly said, "Just like that thing." Blarg. Exian looked at the leopard's leg and finally could not bear it anymore. Her body trembled as she rushed to the bushes at the side. She bent her body and retched. Her face was as pale as paper. Lu Qin quietly looked at her. He did not comfort her, nor did he continue to say those cruel words. After a while, Exian seemed to slowly calm down. She panted as she straightened her body and walked back step by step. She didn't dare to look at the dirty and ferocious old barbarian anymore. She didn't even dare to look at the leopard's leg on the ground. She only timidly walked to Lu Qin's side. After hesitating for a while, she said in a low voice, "Big brother Lu, let's go, okay?" This time, Lu Qin unexpectedly agreed to her straightforwardly. This made Exian feel a little strange. But then she saw Lu Qin turn around and walk towards the barbarian who was moaning on the ground. This man did not roar, did not scold, and did not overflow with killing intent. Even his expression did not seem to change. But Exian felt that the surrounding temperature suddenly became a little colder. The barbarian old man seemed to have sensed something as well. He howled in pain and cursed angrily. His body shrank back with all his might, leaving behind a trail of blood on the ground. But all of this was useless. Lu Qin quickly walked in front of him. Then, under the horrified gaze of Exian, he raised the black dagger and stabbed it. The incomparably sharp blade instantly pierced through the barbarian's flesh and stabbed into the barbarian's heart. The old barbarian's entire body tensed up and curled up. He shouted some strange and unclear words. After a while, the dirty and ferocious head drooped down. His body stiffened and he stopped breathing. Lu Qin pulled out his sword and walked back. His expression was indifferent, as if he had just done something very normal. He said to EXN, "You can go now." EXN blankly nodded. She looked at Lu Qin and suddenly felt an impulse in her heart. She could not help but ask, "Brother Lu, do you have a grudge against these barbarians?" Lu Qin's body paused for a moment. He did not turn back. After a while he said, "I have a grudge against them. But it is not to the extent that I have to kill them. But if someone wants to kill me first, I will kill them first." EXN was speechless. Her expression was complicated. Everything that happened in front of her, including Lu Qin, was completely different from the simple life she had met in the past. It was far beyond her understanding. If the person who saved her yesterday was a strange and brave man, then today, Lu Qin seemed to have suddenly become a completely different person. "Let's go." Lu Qin, who was in front, turned around and called out to her. EXN was shocked. She quickly replied and quickly walked over. But just as she walked past the cave and was about to walk up the slope to leave with Lu Qin, suddenly, a few sorrowful cries came from the entrance of the cave. Then, a small body climbed out of the cave with some difficulty. It was a puppy with black fur and a white stripe on its back. One of its hind legs was unnaturally drooping on the ground. It seemed to be broken. His body was also messy and dirty. It looked extremely miserable. The puppy struggled to climb out as if it had used up the last bit of its strength. It desperately wanted to live. Then it barked a few times at EXN, who was not far away. Woof woof, woof. EXN stopped in her tracks. Her face showed that she could not bear to see it. This kind of compassion made EXN feel a little strange. In the past, when she passed by some towns, she had seen such pitiful stray dogs and cats. But at this moment, her heart seemed to be especially soft. Maybe it was because from last night until today, she suddenly saw too much killing and blood that she had never seen in her life. That kind of heavy pressure almost made it hard for her to breathe. Or maybe she was simply soft-hearted. So she turned around and walked towards the puppy. Lu Qin, who was in front, stopped and looked at her. He frowned. EXN walked to the side of the puppy and squatted down. She carefully looked at it and immediately found that the situation of the puppy was worse than she had imagined. In addition to the broken leg, there were at least a dozen large and small wounds and cracks on the puppy's body. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was covered with cuts and bruises. Some of the flesh near the wounds even looked a little rotten, exuding a disgusting stench. It was really hard to imagine what kind of torture this puppy had suffered in the hands of the ferocious barbarian in the past days. "Let's save it." EXN turned around and shouted at Lu Qin. Lu Qin shook his head expressionlessly. EXN clenched her teeth and slowly stood up. The puppy looked at her and softly barked a few times. EXN's expression changed. The life and death experiences from last night to today flashed in her mind. Those extremely bloody scenes suddenly stimulated her to the point of nausea. She didn't know where the courage came from, or maybe it was a sudden burst of resentment after being suppressed for too long, but EXN suddenly stomped her feet and took out a piece of cloth to wrap the little black dog. She then struggled to pick it up with one hand and walked away with her head lowered. When she walked past Lu Qin, she did not dare to look at his face, but her body still paused for a moment. Then with a soft and slightly trembling voice she said, I want to save it." After saying that, she ran forward in big strides. Lu Qin's face showed a stunned expression. Looking at the girl's back, his face showed a rare look of confusion. "This woman, what is in her brain?" He muttered in a low voice, shook his head and followed. However, he had only taken 2 steps when he suddenly heard a cry in front of him. Lu Qin was startled and looked up. He saw that EXN was running too fast and didn't see the road clearly. Just as she entered the forest, she tripped on a shrub branch and fell on her back. The puppy was also thrown out and landed in the grass with a plop sound. Immediately, wails and cries of alarm rose and fell one after another. Lu Qin sighed helplessly and looked up at the sky. Then he walked over to help EXN up. EXN's face was red and she did not dare to look at him. She lowered her head and patted the dust off her body. Then she ran over to pick up the puppy. Who knew that when she moved, Lu Qin pulled her to the side. EXN panicked and said, "Don't stop me, I want to save." "Shut up." Lu Qin stopped her in a bad mood and walked over to pick up the puppy. He glared at EXN and said, "Don't talk nonsense, let's go." EXN said embarrassedly, "You?" Lu Qin snorted and ignored her. He grabbed the puppy and walked forward. At the same time he said, "I spent a lot of effort to fix your hand. Don't break it again for no reason. So troublesome." EXN's mouth opened. Looking at the man's back, the corner of her mouth suddenly curled up, revealing a happy smile. "Hey, why are you in a daze?" Lu Qin, who was in front, turned back and shouted. Yixian jumped in fright. She quickly chased after him while saying, "Coming, coming." She ran behind Lu Qin like a wisp of smoke, closely following him as they walked out of the forest. Chapter 69. The two of them walked all the way out of the forest and returned to the river valley. Under the sunlight, the bloodthirsty demon flowers were still incomparably gorgeous, and the yellow leopard that had been dragged over not long ago had long disappeared, leaving only a bloodstain on the ground. Lu Qin and Exn walked directly out of the river valley. No matter what, with such a large field of bloodthirsty demon flowers growing here, it was really not a pleasant place to be. After walking out of the river valley, Lu Qin found a flat and safe place by the river. He first put down the little dog in his hand, then called Exn over and examined her injured arm. In the end he nodded and said, "It's good, the bones are not crooked." As he spoke, he looked as if he had been relieved of a heavy burden, but it was unknown whether he was worried about Exn, or remembering the results of his previous treatment for her. After saying this, Lu Qin walked to the side, minding his own business. Exn glanced at him and wanted to say something, but then she immediately swallowed her words. She then walked with some difficulty to the little black dog and sat down next to it. The little black dog raised its head and glanced at her. Speaking of which, it was strange. Even though this little dog's entire body was covered in scars, it stank to the heavens, and its fur was dirty to the point it was knotted together, making it extremely unsightly. Only its eyes were still bright and clear. Perhaps that was the only beautiful thing on its body. Exn sighed and said in a low voice, "I'll help you, don't bite me." The little black dog looked at her for a while, then barked, but it was unknown whether it agreed or not. Exn searched her bosom for a while and after a while, took out a silk handkerchief. Then with some difficulty she used her remaining uninjured hand to use the silk handkerchief to wipe the dust off the little black dog's body, as well as the shocking wounds. Perhaps it felt the kindness of the young woman in front of it, but the little black dog did not avoid or struggle, and actually obediently lay on the ground, not moving at all. In the distance, Lu Qin glanced over, his expression still indifferent and no change could be seen. However, Exin's movements looked a little clumsy, and it was obvious that she had never done such a thing before. In addition, the little black dog's injuries were too many and too heavy, so after a few tries she accidentally touched the little black dog's wounds, immediately causing its body to tremble and let out a cry. Exin's hand suddenly trembled and she hurriedly said in a soft voice, I'm sorry, I'll be gentle. Woof 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 woof." Before her voice died away, the little black dog let out another cry. It turned out that Exin had just avoided a wound, and then pressed on another wound, causing the little black dog to tremble in pain. This happened a few times in a row. On the originally calm and peaceful riverside, only the dog's barking could be heard, mournful and painful with a bit of helplessness. The young woman's forehead was covered in sweat, and her only hand kept waving the silk handkerchief, and every movement was a little stiff. In the end, she did not even dare to press down again, and her pair of eyes flickered with tears, looking like she was about to cry. "Hey!" A familiar voice rang out behind her. Exin shivered and looked back, only to see that Lu Qin had walked behind her, and stood there with a helpless expression on his face. He used his hand to gently pat his forehead and said, "Get out of the way." Exin was stunned for a moment and said, "What are you doing?" Lu Qin glared at her unhappily and said, "Although I didn't want to save this dog in the beginning, but I can't just watch you make it suffer to death here." Exin was speechless, and her face was red as if it was about to catch fire. She hurriedly took a step back and at the same time she muttered in a low voice, I didn't mean to." Lu Qin did not pay attention to her at all, and squatted down to look at the little black dog, and then looked at the injuries on its body and finally touched the broken leg, and his eyebrows slowly wrinkled. Exin had been watching him carefully, and seeing his serious expression, her heart could not help but sink and she hurriedly asked, "Brother Lu, how is it? Is the little dog okay?" Lu Qin did not answer her question and only pondered for a moment, and then glanced at the little dog and said lightly, "If you want to live, be obedient." Facing Lu Qin, the little black dog was obviously much more nervous than before, and its whole body looked a little stiff, and then it softly whimpered a few times, and it was unknown whether it understood Lu Qin's words. Lu Qin turned his hand, and the black dagger appeared in his hand again, and then directly turned his hand over to cut the little black dog. Exin, who was standing to the side, cried out in alarm, and her body involuntarily took a step forward. The little black dog also suddenly barked, and it looked like it was scared out of its wits, and there was a look of despair in its eyes as it lay on the ground. But after a moment, suddenly, a piece of black fur was seen floating in the air, and then slowly falling down. It turned out that Lu Qin had swung his sword to scrape off a piece of fur on the little dog's body, and then they saw him move the sword as if it was flying, one slash after another, and actually began to shave the little dog's fur. In the midst of this, because of all kinds of tangled fur, and because it was riddled with wounds, it could not avoid touching the little black dog's wounds, and the little dog was in so much pain that it cried out, but the expression on Lu Chen's face did not change. And as if frightened by the sharp murderous aura of the black dagger, although the little dog cried out in pain, it still forced its body to lie on the ground, and did not dare to move at all. Not long after, fur was scattered on the ground, and the little dog from head to toe, all the fur on its body was shaved. The original little black dog had become a little bald dog, and its body was completely bare, and it was really ugly and comical. But it also made it more clear that the little dog's body was densely covered with wounds, and it was a ghastly sight. After finishing the shave, Lu Qin did not stop. First, he swept over all the little dog's wounds, ignoring the old wounds that had already formed scabs, and first sprinkled some medicinal powder on the new wounds, and then used cloth to bandage them. Then he went to the wounds that had already rotted, and after a pause he stretched out his hand to press the little dog's body, and then glanced at the little dog and said calmly, "Bear with it." The bald little dog stared blankly at Lu Qin, and then looked at the black dagger in his hand, and its body violently convulsed and trembled. Under the horrified gaze of Exin, Lu Qin directly swung the dagger down, and the sword cut into the little dog's rotting wounds, and then with a twist of the blade, the rotten flesh was directly cut off, and he flung it to the side. The little dog let out an incomparably shrill cry, as if its heart and lungs were being torn apart, and its whole body trembled incessantly. But what was surprising was that although it looked like it was in extreme pain, it really was lying on the ground, not moving. This puppy was actually enduring the pain with great difficulty. Lu Qin also seemed to be a little surprised, and he tilted his head to look at it, a faint trace of admiration in his eyes. Chapter 70. Although he was surprised by the black puppy's endurance, Lu Qin's hands did not stop. The black sword danced around the puppy's body, and not long after, 3 pieces of rotten flesh were cut off from the puppy's body. Fresh blood flowed all over the ground. Then Lu Qin skillfully took out some strange medicinal powder and sprinkled it on the puppy's wounds. The bleeding quickly stopped, and he used a white cloth to bandage the puppy's wounds. After that, the puppy looked like it was on the verge of death. It had no strength left and could only rest its head on the ground, gasping for air. On the other hand, Exin, who was standing at the side, was horrified, and her face seemed to be slightly pale. However, after seeing that the wounds were bandaged with white cloth, Exin heaved a sigh of relief and said softly, "Thank you, Brother Lu." Lu Qin looked at her and said, "It's not over yet." Exin was shocked and said, "What else?" Lu Qin silently turned his head as if he had nothing to say. He just pointed at the puppy's hind leg. There was a broken leg there. Exin was speechless and did not know what to say. Fortunately, Lu Qin did not say much. He walked to the side and chopped a wooden stick just like how he treated Exin this morning. Taking advantage of this gap, Exin squatted beside the puppy and said softly, "Puppy, don't be afraid. Brother Lu is very powerful. He will heal all your wounds. This leg is different from your hand." Lu Qin's voice rang in her ear. Exin looked up and saw Lu Qin squatting down again with a wooden stick. He said calmly, "Although your hand is broken, it was reattached quickly and there is medicine. If there are no accidents, it will recover in 1 or 2 months. However, this puppy's leg is different. It has been broken for too long." What will happen to it?" Exin asked anxiously. Lu Qin thought for a while and said, "It can probably be reattached, but it definitely won't recover. The best case scenario is that it will become a lame dog." "Lame dog?" Exin muttered blankly. She didn't know what to say. On the other side, Lu Qin had already grabbed the broken dog's leg. First he checked the wound, then he cleaned it carefully. He carefully aligned the bones and applied some medicinal powder. Finally, he used a strip of white cloth to tie the dog's leg tightly to the wooden stick. At this point, the plan to save the dog had finally come to an end. Looking at it now, not only was the original black puppy bald, its body was also covered with white strips of cloth, and a wooden stick was tied to its hind leg. It was as comical as one could imagine, but compared to the tragic scene in the barbarian's cave, it was much better. After such a torment they were delayed for a long time. The two of them did not travel far that day. In the end, they only walked for a few miles from the river valley before the sky darkened. As usual, it was not allowed to light a fire in the night in the disordered land. Lu Qin and Exian did not stay in the open space near the river bank. According to Lu Qin, when night came, it was very likely that some monsters would come to the river bank to drink water. At that time, staying there would only lead to death. Exian naturally listened to Lu Qin. Thus, the two of them found a tall tree and climbed up, bringing along the dog. When the sky was completely dark, Exian leaned against the tree trunk and hugged the wrapped-up dog in her arms. She comforted it softly, looking like she was comforting a child. Her voice was slow and gentle, like the whispers of the forest, but also like a warm spring breeze. "Don't be afraid. We've already saved you, so of course we won't abandon you. At least we'll wait until you've recovered. When that time comes, I'll let you go. Even if you let it go, it will still die," Lu Qin, who was sitting on the other side of the tree, suddenly said. Exian was a little surprised. "What?" Lu Qin raised his head and looked at the gloomy and dark night sky. After a moment of silence, he said, "Didn't you ask me earlier why this kind of dog doesn't need to be saved?" "Yes. This dog is a mixed breed. Its bloodline comes from two kinds of monsters, the snow wolf and the black jackal. The snow wolf was a proud and powerful high-grade demon beast. It had always lived alone. When the male snow wolf is in heat, it will casually rape the weak black jackal because it can't find a mate. However, it will never care about its offspring. The black jackal, on the other hand, is naturally fierce and autistic. It especially values the purity of the dog's bloodline. Once a mixed breed like this appears in front of the black jackal, it will be attacked by all the black jackals and directly torn to pieces. This is also the reason why these mixed breeds almost never grow up. Almost all dogs are bitten to death as soon as they are born." Exian silently lowered her head. The puppy in her arms softly whimpered. No one knew if it was complaining about its tragic fate. Why this unlucky puppy was not bitten to death when it was born and why it fell into the hands of the old barbarian to be tortured. These things were naturally untraceable now. However, the following days were considered peaceful. Lu Qin led Exian and the puppy forward in the disorienting lands. They did not encounter any major problems along the way. About 5 days later they finally returned to the Leaping Tiger Gorge. Thinking about it, it was as if they had gone around in a circle and came back. However, there were 4 of them when they entered the disorienting lands, but only 2 were left. This inevitably made Exian feel a little sad. On the contrary, in these 5 days, the unlucky puppy seemed to have a cheap life. Its heavy injuries actually healed very quickly. After a few days it was able to run around on the ground. However, just as Lu Qin had said before, this puppy's leg was forever lame. When it ran it would limp, making it look very awkward and ugly. Strangely enough, after this puppy was able to move around freely, Lu Qin and Exian did not hold on to it. However, the puppy obediently followed them and never showed any signs of sneaking away. It just followed them all the way. As they entered the Leaping Tiger Gorge, Lu Qin glanced at the puppy. Seeing that it was very curious as it limped back and forth, looking at the surrounding scenery, Lu Qin could not be bothered with it. Instead, he said to Exian, "After this, we will be considered to have left the disorienting lands. Let's go our separate ways here." Exian's footsteps paused for a moment. After a moment of hesitation, she looked at Lu Qin with a sincere expression of gratitude. She said, "Brother Lu, I really thank you." Lu Qin smiled and said, "Don't mention it. It was nothing." Exian shook her head and sighed. "It's not like that. I know that I am a very stupid person and caused you a lot of trouble along the way. Brother Lu, I won't say anything else. If there is a chance in the future, come find me at Kunlun Mountain. I will definitely." "Huh?" Lu Qin was stunned. He stopped in his tracks and looked at Exian with a shocked expression. "What? You are a disciple of the Kunlun party?" Chapter 71. Exian blushed and said, "Well, I'm not really one yet, but I should be one after a while." Lu Qin became curious and asked a few more questions. As it turned out, although Exian looked delicate, she was actually a woman with an impressive background. She was born in Kunwu City at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains. She was the daughter of a member of the clan. The clan had a close relationship with the Kunlun party for many years. Over the years, many of their disciples had entered the Kunlun party. When Exian was young, a powerful golden core cultivator had taken a fancy to this girl's potential. He had contacted the Yi family in advance and was prepared to take her in as a disciple. However, something unexpected happened to Jean Dan Friar and he was seriously injured. He was forced to go into seclusion for 10 years, which delayed Yi Xian's acceptance as a disciple. However, this matter was known to the Kunlun party and the Yi clan did not conceal it. Therefore, almost everyone in the Kunlun Mountains regarded Yi Xian as a disciple of the Kunlun sect. The two people who came with Yi Xian this time were also official disciples of the Kunlun party. When they accepted the task of gathering the dusk fog flower, they brought Yi Xian with them. Firstly, it was to show their closeness. Secondly, it was also to curry favor with Jean Dan Friar, who was rumored to be recovering from his injuries and coming out of seclusion. Once that powerful person came out of seclusion, it wouldn't be long before Yi Xian officially entered the Kunlun party. Congratulations, congratulations, Lu Qin said to Yi Xian with a smile. Yi Xian smiled and nodded. Looking at Lu Qin, she felt that this man's smile was gentle and his face was calm. He looked harmless, but he didn't have the cold murderous aura that he occasionally displayed in the land of chaos. For a moment, Yi Xian was even in a trance. She felt that when she looked at Lu Qin she was hallucinating. One was a man standing in the light with a gentle smile, the other was a cold and murderous demon hiding in the dark. However, this kind of thinking was a bit ridiculous. Yi Xian shook her head to get rid of this boring thought and said goodbye to Lu Qin. Then she waved at the dog standing next to her and said with a smile, "Atsu, come here, I'll take you home." Atsu was the name they gave to the dog. Originally, Lu Qin had given the dog even more random and unpleasant names such as Hei Wang, Hua, Baldy. In his words, the dog would run away sooner or later anyway, so there was no need to bother giving it a good name. Finally, when Yi Xian saw that the dog was pitiful, she mustered up the courage to speak up for justice and argued for this unlucky dog. After refuting these unpleasant names one by one, the two reluctantly came up with a homonym for Baldy, and simply called it Atsu. Although it sounded rustic, it was at least down to earth and not particularly unpleasant. Although it still felt a little like calling a peasant dog, looking at Atsu's current appearance, not only was it bald, it was also wrapped in a lot of cloth strips. Coupled with that limping leg, it really didn't look good. It might not even be as good as a real peasant dog. So a peasant dog, so be it. That was probably what Yi Xian thought helplessly at the time. However, ever since they left the river valley in the land of chaos, Yi Xian had grown to like Atsu a little. Speaking of which, she grew up in the Yi family, so her living conditions were naturally excellent. However, due to her strict upbringing, she had never raised a cat or a dog. Now she really liked Atsu, which had been rather obedient these few days. Lu Qin stood at the side and looked at Yi Xian in surprise. "You're taking it home to raise?" "Yes," Yi Xian said happily. "Atsu is also very pitiful. Look at how badly it's injured." Lu Qin glanced at Atsu, who was standing not too far away from his feet. When he first found him, he was indeed severely injured. However, this dog had the bloodline of a demonic beast, so his recovery ability was astonishing. In just a few days, the wounds on his body had healed a lot, especially the injury on his broken leg. Although he couldn't change the fact that he was lame, he could still run after throwing away the wooden stick. In comparison, the wooden stick in Yi Xian's hand was still there. Lu Qin shrugged and said, "If you want to raise it, then raise it. Up to you. Atsu, come here." Yi Xian waved at the puppy with a smile on her face. Atsu obediently wagged its tail and ran to her feet. Yi Xian squatted down and touched Atsu's bald head with a doting look on her face. "Atsu, say goodbye to Brother Lu. We're going home." Atsu tilted its head and looked at Yi Xian with a pair of unusually bright eyes. Then it barked twice. Yi Xian laughed. She pointed at Lu Qin and said, "We're saying goodbye to Brother Lu. We're leaving soon." Atsu blinked its eyes. It looked at Yi Xian, then looked back at Lu Qin. Then it barked at Yi Xian again. Then it turned around and ran to Lu Qin's side, lying down. Lu Qin and Yi Xian were stunned at the same time. It didn't look like it was going to say goodbye. After a while, Lu Qin suddenly frowned as if he thought of something. On the other side, Yi Xian ran over and reached out to hug Atsu. At the same time she said, "Atsu, are you stupid? I mean..." Before she finished speaking, the puppy shrank back and avoided Yi Xian's arm. Then it hid behind Lu Qin. This time the meaning of Atsu couldn't be clearer. Yi Xian also stood up in shock. After a while, she suddenly felt a little embarrassed and said angrily, "Hey, Stinky Atsu, are you kidding me? These days I'm the one who fed you, hugged you when you slept, and played with you normally. But now you choose Brother Lu and not me?" Atsu's bald head poked out from behind Lu Chen's calf. It looked a little sneaky. Then it barked twice as if admitting to it. Luchin rolled his eyes. Atsu rubbed its head against his leg and wagged its tail like a windmill. It looked like it was trying to flatter him. Exn rubbed her forehead with her hand. Then she pointed at Atsu and said, You. Luchin coughed and said, I can roughly guess the reason. What is it? Exin immediately asked. For millions of years, the chaotic lands has always been a dangerous world where the strong prey on the weak. The countless creatures here, including demonic beasts of all sizes, have long gotten used to this set of rules. So, when they are still small and weak, if they have a choice, all demonic beasts will follow their innate instincts and attach themselves to the stronger side. Luchin looked at Exin and smiled. He didn't finish his sentence. Exin stood rooted to the ground. Her pretty face was a little red. After a while, she said hatefully, Damn it, even a little bastard like you is looking down on me. Chapter 72. Atsu looked at Exin with some affection in its eyes, but it still refused to come out from behind Luchin. It seemed that it was determined to follow Luchin. Luchin also sighed and said to Atsu, Hey, stupid dog, let me tell you, if you follow her, you can live a good life without worrying about food and drink. That is a happy life. If you follow me, you won't have a good life. Maybe you will die in the wilderness at any time. That's right. Exin repeated, looking at Atsu eagerly. This time, Atsu didn't even look at Exin, it just looked at Luchin and wagged its tail desperately. You stupid dog. Exin was so angry that she couldn't speak, but she was also a little reluctant to leave Atsu. Her eyes were a little red. In the following period of time, 2 people and a dog spent almost half a cup of tea's time at the exit of the Leaping Tiger Gorge. However, no matter how much Exin tried to persuade him, Atsu was still indifferent. In the end, Exin finally gave up. She had no choice but to say goodbye to Luchin. Before she left, she sighed and said to Luchin, Brother Lu, from now on Atsu is in your hands, you must. When I am hungry, I will kill it and stew it. Luchin said to Exin very calmly. Exin was stunned. After a while, she stammered, What did you say? Luchin said matter-of-factly, I didn't want to keep a dog. Even when I saved it that day, you insisted. I didn't ask it to follow me. If this dog insists, I can stew it and eat it. It doesn't seem to be a problem. Something's wrong. Exin almost shouted. Then she put on a sad face and said, Brother Lu, Atsu is so pitiful. Don't eat it, just let it go. Luchin looked at her appearance and couldn't help but laugh for a moment. There was an inexplicable warmth in his heart. Exin was still young and seemed to have been spoiled since childhood. She was indeed very pure. However, he didn't know why her family would allow such an inexperienced girl like her to come to such a dangerous place like the Land of Chaos. Luchin was startled. He frowned and looked at Exin from head to toe. Being stared at like this, Exin suddenly felt guilty. She took a step back and said, Brother Lu, what's wrong? Luchin snorted and said, Don't tell me you snuck out without telling your family? Exin was speechless. Her beautiful face flushed red. Looking at her, the answer was obvious. Luchin shook his head and said, Forget it, it's none of my business. But we all know each other. You should be more careful in the future and don't run around. Exin lowered her head. Her eyes reddened as if she had thought of something. I know. I will definitely apologize to my parents when I get back. And I even implicated Senior Uncle Han and Senior Brother He. If it wasn't for me, they... Hey! Luchin suddenly interrupted her and frowned. What nonsense are you talking about? What does their death have to do with you? Exin bit her lip and said, My cultivation is low. When the black jackals surrounded us, I couldn't help them, so... Nonsense! Luchin snorted with disdain, and he looked at the young woman as if he was looking at an idiot. Are you stupid? This has nothing to do with you. It was your first time coming to the chaotic lands. Han Nanzu and He Gang are proper disciples of Kunlun. They have cultivation and experience. Isn't it natural for them to take care of you? Wasn't it their fault that we ended up in that situation? He sneered and said, Not to mention the fact that I reminded them several times before I left that day. It's fine if you're young and insensible, but those 2 men were actually blinded by greed. They deserved to die. Instead they dragged you down. Do you understand? Exin was at a loss. After a while she said with uncertainty, Is that so? Luchin said, Of course it is so. Exin, I'm telling you, it's a good thing that you're kind-hearted, but if you can't tell right from wrong and blame yourself for everything you see, then you're not kind-hearted. EXN lowered her head and blushed. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye and asked guiltily, What is that? Lu Qin said angrily, that is called being stupid. Everything that needed to be said had finally been said. The dog that needed to go was stubbornly refusing to leave. EXN, who could not do anything about Atsu, finally waved goodbye to Lu Qin and the dog. Before they parted, she repeatedly exhorted Lu Qin and begged him for two things. First, he must not eat Atsu. He is very obedient and honest, and he is fated to be with us. If he eats him, there might be retribution. Second, Big Brother Lu, if you have the chance in the future, you must come to Kunlun Mountain to find me, okay? It is too dangerous to be a guide in the land of chaos. Why don't I beg my parents and master to help you find a job as a Kunlun Party's odd-job disciple? It is safe and comfortable, and you will be respected when you go out. Also, don't forget to bring Atsu to find me. I know. Even though Lu Qin was experienced, he could not stand the girl's long-winded pleading. He said, I will not eat this dog. At most, I will ignore it. It is getting late. You should be on your way. Woof 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 woof. Atsu lay at Lu Qin's feet and barked at EXN. EXN nodded. She was a little reluctant to part with Atsu. She had not seen much of the world. This time she had stayed with Lu Qin and Atsu for so many days, so she had some feelings for them. She looked back with every step and waved her hand every 2 steps. She slowly left Lu Qin and walked forward. Lu Qin and Atsu looked at her together, and then gradually, the look in the eyes of the man and dog became a little strange. They must be a little reluctant to part with me, Yexian thought. She felt a little warm but also a little shy. Her footsteps became slower. But at this moment she suddenly heard Lu Qin's somewhat exasperated voice from behind her. Hey! What? EXN suddenly turned around and looked at Lu Qin. You are walking in the opposite direction. EXN suddenly froze on the spot as if she had been petrified. She looked around with difficulty and found that she had walked into the Leaping Tiger Gorge again. A moment later she suddenly let out a soft cry and covered her eyes with her hands. She didn't dare to look at Lu Qin and Atsu again. She turned around and ran away with large strides, disappearing into the distance like a wisp of smoke. Vaguely, it seemed that Lu Qin's voice came from behind the dust. It seemed that he was talking to the dog beside him. Atsu, I can't believe there is someone more stupid than you. Woof 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 woof. Atsu barked again and again. It seemed to be very dissatisfied. Chapter 73. Autumn had passed unknowingly, and the Crescent City outside the Land of Chaos had also entered winter. Compared to the legendary Great Ice Sea of the North that could freeze people into ice cubes, the winter here was not considered difficult. At most, one would need to add 1 or 2 layers of clothing. If a cultivator was strong enough, even this could be waived. Lu Qin walked leisurely in the Crescent City, and not far behind him, a limping black puppy was following closely. Although he had warned EXN sternly when they parted, Lu Qin did not really slaughter Atsu in the end. The current Atsu was completely different from when he was found in the Land of Chaos. The shaved hair on its body had grown back and it was no longer that ugly bald dog. And at this moment Atsu's body was a size bigger than before. Its black fur was glossy, and its movements were relaxed and agile. Its pair of dog eyes were bright and intelligent, and it looked very lively. It was as if its entire body had become a different dog. Probably only its lame legs still stubbornly recorded its painful past. After passing a street corner, in front of him was the busiest market in the Crescent City. People came and went and the noise was like waves of water. Lu Qin looked left and right, and continued to walk forward without a change in expression. Behind him, Atsu looked around and suddenly burrowed into the crowd, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Lu Qin casually looked back and his expression was indifferent as if he did not care. He just continued to walk forward and not long after he walked to the busiest place in the market. Suddenly he saw a group of people gathered in front of the bulletin board on the street, whispering and discussing as if they had seen something surprising. Lu Qin's curiosity was piqued, and he also walked over. He squeezed into the crowd and looked at the bulletin board. He saw that on top of the layers of old paper, there was indeed a new piece of yellow paper, and a few lines of words were written on it. Arrest the great thief Blue Butterfly. This monster is greedy, lustful, and extremely vicious. He has committed countless evil deeds, murder, arson, rape, and pillage, and has caused great harm to the world. Recently, it has been rumored that he has fled to the Land of Chaos. Along the way, cultivators are hunting him down, and anyone who captures this monster will be rewarded with 5,000 spirit stones. The last signature was impressively the famous Zhangxianmeng. The surrounding passers-by were discussing. Some people expressed anger and disdain for Blue Butterfly's many evil deeds, while others lamented that since Zhangxianmeng had appeared, there was no place for this monster in the world. It was no wonder that he could only run to the most dangerous and chaotic land of chaos, where Zhangxianmeng's power was the weakest. Lu Qin stood in front of the notice board and looked at it for a while. His expression became slightly strange. After a while, he suddenly sighed and cursed to himself in a low voice, "What a bitch." Lu Qin turned away from the notice board and walked out of the market. When he was halfway there, he saw a black shadow flash beside him. It was the black dog. He didn't know where it came from, but it was holding a bone in its mouth. There wasn't much meat on it, so Lu Qin didn't know where it found it. When Atsu saw Lu Qin, it came over and wagged its tail at him affectionately. Then it placed the bone at Lu Qin's feet. Lu Qin rolled his eyes and said, "Atsu, I've told you many times I don't eat this." Atsu didn't seem to understand Lu Qin's words, but he looked very happy and barked at Lu Qin twice. Lu Qin shook his head and reached out to touch Atsu's head. Then he continued to walk forward. When Atsu saw this, it quickly picked up the bone on the ground and chewed on it along the way, following Lu Qin. When the man and the dog walked out of the Crescent City gate, the bone in Atsu's mouth was already gone. After leaving the city, Lu Qin brought Atsu all the way south. Unknowingly, they walked to the familiar Leaping Tiger Gorge. However, this time, Lu Qin didn't enter the gorge. Instead, he looked up at the Dragon Mountain and Tiger Mountain. After pondering for a moment, he turned to the side and walked into the dense forest. He followed the mountain and went up the Dragon Mountain. Legend had it that there were dragons on the Dragon Mountain a long time ago. However, this legend was just like the Dragon Lake on the Tea Mountain in Qingshiteng village. The ancestors just casually talked about it and the descendants just listened to it. The forest on the Dragon Mountain was dense, and there were almost no roads to follow. It could be seen that almost no one came to the mountain. Lu Qin and Atsu climbed from the foot of the mountain for almost an hour, but they still hadn't walked out of the forest. However, they saw a small hill with 3 or 4 rocks exposed on the ground. The surface of the rocks was mottled and covered with moss. Lu Qin looked in that direction for a while, then raised his head to look at the color of the sky. He then walked around the rocks and came to a place that was several zhang higher. He crouched down under a tree root that allowed him to see the rocks below. Atsu wagged its tail and walked to Lu Qin's side. There was some doubt in its bright eyes. Lu Qin smiled at it, then put his hand to his mouth and gestured for it to keep quiet. Atsu tilted its head, and its 2 dog ears lowered slightly. After a while it actually laid down beside Lu Qin. The forest was very quiet. From time to time, there were crisp bird cries coming from the branches and leaves above their heads, making the forest seem even more quiet. And in a place further away, there were occasional roars of beasts, but they couldn't tell what kind of beasts it was. Lu Qin had been lying on the ground, motionless for a long time. His eyes were calm and most of the time he was staring at the rocks below. It was just that nothing had changed after such a long time. The waiting was a little frustrating and Atsu couldn't help but move from time to time. Sometimes he would use his claws to pat the fallen leaves beneath him, and sometimes he would rub his head against Lu Qin's body. Most of the time he would use his nose to sniff around. They waited and waited, and the light in the forest gradually dimmed. The day seemed to be coming to an end. Atsu seemed to be a little bored. It opened its mouth and yawned, but Lu Qin was unusually patient. Looking at him, it seemed that he still wanted to wait. Night was coming and the forest became dark. Lu Qin slowly propped himself up and carefully looked around. When the corner of his eyes swept to his side, he was suddenly startled. He discovered that in this pitch-black place Atsu, who was lying beside him, had a pair of eyes that slowly brightened in the darkness. A faint green luster appeared, like a ball of dark green fire, quietly burning in the silent darkness. Lu Qin reached over, hugged Atsu's head and touched it. Atsu made a low whine as if it was responding to something. Then Lu Qin let go of his hand, stood up and slowly walked down. The forest was dark and he couldn't even see his fingers in front of him. But he seemed to be able to see things in the dark, and his steps were extremely accurate and steady. Not long after he walked to the side of the rocks. He squatted down, put one hand on the edge of the largest rock, and gently touched the bottom of the rock with the other. The moist moss exuded water vapor and his fingers were wet. In the darkness, Lu Qin fumbled for a moment, and then found something from the dark gap under the rock. He put it in his arms, turned around and left. Chapter 74. The darkness obscured the movements of all the figures. Only a pair of eyes that were like eerie flames flickered faintly in the forest. It was a rather terrifying sight to behold. Especially when Lu Qin walked back, that pair of ghostly flames suddenly pounced over, causing one's heart to tremble. Lu Qin stretched out a hand to block Atu's head, which was wagging its tail in the dark. "You don't look like that usually, but you're pretty scary at night, you stupid dog." Lu Qin snorted. "Woof woof woof." Atsu barked twice in a low voice as if it was proud of itself. It was not ashamed but proud. Lu Qin shook his head helplessly and said, "Let's go." Under the cover of the night, the figures of a man and a dog quietly left in the darkness, like ghosts in the lonely mountains. After descending the Dragon Mountain, it was still late at night outside. Lu Qin did not immediately rush back to the Crescent City. In fact, at this time the Crescent City had already closed its doors. If he did not have the ability to fly, even if he returned, he would not be able to enter the city. Lu Qin brought Atsu to a secluded place far away from the Dragon Mountain, and then took out something from his bosom. It was the item that he had taken out from the cracks in the rocks in the forest. At this moment, with the help of the faint starlight in the sky, he saw that it was a sealed letter. Yellow bast paper, red wax seal. Other than that, there were no marks or words on the envelope. Lu Qin silently looked at the envelope in his hand. After a moment, he expressionlessly tore open the seal, took out a piece of paper and started reading. Of course, there were words on the letter, but there were only a few lines. Lu Qin quickly finished reading it. When he saw the last sentence of the letter, his face, which had always been calm, suddenly changed. It was a very strange change. It was not anger, nor was it joy. It was like a kind of memory. All kinds of emotions surged into his heart in an instant. They flashed across his eyes. At that moment, his expression was so complicated. But in the end, everything returned to silence. Phew! A sudden soft sound startled Atsu, who was lying next to Lu Qin. When he turned his head, he saw Lu Qin lighting up a small match in his hand. Then he lit up the letter together with the envelope. The flames quickly swept up and engulfed the letter. The light of the fire illuminated Lu Qin's face in the darkness and was reflected in the depths of his eyes. After a while he sighed softly and said in a low voice, "The ghost won't go away." Lu Qin woke up when the first ray of sunlight shone from the horizon. Without any hesitation he led Atsu to the south. When the leaping tiger gorge appeared in front of him, Lu Qin did not hesitate at all. He strode forward and re-entered the land of chaos. Atsu, the black dog, did not seem to have much resistance to returning to the old place. Instead, it seemed to be very excited about this vast mountain world. It ran and jumped around in front of and behind Lu Qin. It sniffed everywhere with its nose and found a few towering trees to pee on. However, no matter what, Atsu would not be too far away from Lu Qin. In fact, it followed Lu Qin even more closely than when it was in Crescent City. It almost never left Lu Qin's sight. One man and one dog walked all the way. The route they took was actually the same as the route that Lu Qin took to the Black Armor Mountain with Xin and the others. Therefore, on the second day, Lu Qin and Atsu once again stood at the fork in the road near the Black Armor Mountain. Atu stuck out its tongue and squatted on the ground looking left and right. Its expression was relatively calm, and it didn't seem to be excited about returning home. Or perhaps the stupid dog didn't even remember that a place not far from here might be its home. Lu Qin glanced at the Black Armor Mountain in the distance and walked in another direction with an indifferent expression. That direction led to the deeper part of the land of chaos. In that direction, there was a past that was buried in the passage of time. It was full of blood, hatred, and betrayal. There was a deserted valley there. On the sixth day, Lu Qin and Atsu arrived at the deserted valley. The dangers and difficulties they encountered on the way were far greater than what they had experienced in the Black Armor Mountain. The demonic beasts on the way also rapidly became stronger. Especially the closer they were to the deserted valley, the more dangerous the demonic beasts became. Even the invisible signs of the spiritual power of the five elements became much more intense. Fortunately, Lu Qin seemed to be particularly good at this kind of dangerous thing. After many times avoiding the ferocious demonic beasts and many strange dangers, he and Atsu finally arrived at the outside of the valley. The deserted valley was a steep valley surrounded by mountains. There was only a narrow passage connecting it to the outside world. Since ancient times, there had been a strange power in the deserted valley, which made it impossible for all living creatures to live in it. That was why it was called the Deserted Valley. 10 years ago, there were remnants of the divine sect of the three realms doing evil in this place. However, they were detected in advance by the righteous Zhengxian Ming, who sent an army to surround and annihilate them. The evildoers were wiped out and the world was cleansed. It was said that the battle was earth-shattering, the wind and clouds changed color, the mountains shook, and the evildoers of the Devil's sect suffered heavy casualties. However, after the battle, this place was filled with evil spirits. Ordinary cultivators with weak cultivation couldn't get close to it. It was said that it was caused by a curse cast by the great cultivator of the Devil's sect before he died. Anyway, this valley was originally deserted, so after a long time no one came here. When Lu Qin walked on the narrow mountain path, he looked at the somewhat familiar mountainous terrain around him. There was a trace of complexity in his eyes. However, when he walked to the entrance of the deserted valley, he suddenly stopped. In his memory there was a figure standing on the small hill next to the mountain path. The mountain breeze blew past, the clothes fluttered. Lu Qin was in a trance for a moment. It was as if he saw a handsome man in white. But that illusion disappeared in a blink of an eye. What reflected in his eyes was a fatty standing against the wind. "Hey!" That fatty stood on a high place, waved at Lu Qin with a laugh and shouted, "Long time no see." Lu Qin's mouth twitched, looked at the stupidly fat old ma jumping down from the small hill. He sneered and said, "Why are you not dead yet?" Old ma sternly said, "This is not right of you. We have known each other for a while. We have been neighbors in the same village for 10 years. You come up and ask me if I am dead or not. Can we still be friends?" Lu Qin spat and said, "If we are friends then don't come and bother me." Old ma shrugged and said with a bitter smile, "If it was me, of course I wouldn't come and find you. Isn't it because I have no choice?" Lu Qin was startled. Suddenly his face changed slightly and said, "You mean?" Old ma glanced at the valley behind him and said in a low voice, "He is also here." The corner of Lu Qin's eyes twitched slightly. There was a trace of complicated glimmer in the depths of his eyes. He stood there in silence. Old ma looked at his expression. He wanted to say something but stopped. In the end he sighed softly and patted Lu Qin's shoulder. He said, "Go in, he wants to see you." Lu Qin lowered his head slightly and didn't say another word. After a long period of silence, he finally strode forward and slowly walked into the desolate valley that had been uninhabited for a long time. The towering precipice was like a sharp sword that pierced through the sky, blocking out the sun and leaving only a shadow on the earth. Just like that, Lu Qin once again walked into the shadow without a sound, gradually disappearing. Chapter 75. It was supposed to be a sunny day, but as soon as they entered the desolate valley, they saw that the ring-shaped sky formed by the huge mountains above their heads was filled with dark clouds. The dark clouds were thick and low, causing one's heart to feel oppressed. Lu Qin's eyes swept across the gloomy and dark valley. Everywhere he looked, there was not even a blade of grass growing. It was either hard, towering cliffs or weathered, cracked earth. Gusts of cold wind blew from the depths of the valley, stirring up clouds of gray dust. Further away, because the wind blew through the cracks in the weathered rocks, there was a constant shrill howl. It sounded like the souls of the dead who died here a long time ago were still howling with resentment. The little black dog followed Lu Qin's footsteps into the desolate valley. Although as a monster, it instinctively disliked this lifeless place, its desire to be with Lu Qin suppressed this feeling. However, when it walked into the valley, especially after following Lu Qin for a distance of about 10 feet, Atsu suddenly stopped. It groaned in a low voice and its face seemed to be in pain. Its whole body was trembling slightly as if it was feeling very uncomfortable. However, after glancing at Lu Qin in front of it, Atsu hesitated for a moment, but it still insisted on walking forward. But soon something even worse happened. After only a few steps, Atsu's footing became unstable. Its body swayed and after every 2 steps it took, it would lose its balance. Not long after, it fell to the ground with a thud, and all 4 of its legs began to twitch. A shadow suddenly blocked its sight. Atsu groaned in a low voice and looked up, only to see that Lu Qin had returned to its side. After reaching out and gently touching Atsu's head, Lu Qin carried it and walked back to the entrance of the valley. Then he put Atsu on the ground and said in a low voice, "Wait for me here." Atsu panted for a while, and the abnormalities in his body gradually subsided. It stood up again, glanced at Lu Qin and then stuck out its tongue to lick Lu Qin's palm. Lu Qin smiled, then turned around and walked away, quickly disappearing into the depths of the gloomy valley. Only a gust of chilly wind swept past, sweeping up a cloud of dust and obscuring the world. Atsu was the only dog left at the entrance of the valley. It lay there for a while. Perhaps it was bored or perhaps it felt that something was wrong. It stood up and looked around. The surroundings were desolate and there was no movement at all. Atu hesitated for a moment, then tried to take a step forward. But after a few steps, Atu immediately felt that strange feeling from before again, so he quickly retreated. Then it tried to walk a few steps along the edge of the valley, and soon discovered that this way of walking would not trigger the strange phenomenon. Atsu shook its body, stretched, and waited in the same place for a long time. But for some reason Luchin still did not come back. Atsu waited in boredom. After a while, it finally stood up and slowly walked along the stone wall of the valley. The stone wall was hard and rough. It was unknown how many years it had been eroded by wind and rain here. It looked strange in shape and many places were even as sharp as the edge of a knife. Atsu avoided those dangerous stones and slowly walked forward curiously. As it walked, it just happened to detour around a thick stone ridge that was filled with cracks. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew past. In an instant, all the cracks in the stone were filled with strong winds. Almost at the same time, a dozen incomparably shrill cries suddenly sounded behind Atu. Roar! Gee! At that moment, it was as if thousands of ghosts were howling, and the scene could be said to be extremely terrifying. Atu was shocked and all the hair on his body instantly stood up. He let out a terrified howl and almost subconsciously ran forward. This was really a desperate run. Along the stone wall of the valley, Atsu did not know how far it ran until it could not hold its breath anymore. The terrifying screams behind it could no longer be heard. Only then did it stop, panting, and looked back with a frightened look. It stood there for a moment, still panting, and looked very nervous. Its eyes kept looking in the direction of the strange screams, as if it was afraid that a terrible monster would suddenly jump out from the dark corner. At the same time, it subconsciously slowly retreated, feeling that the farther it was from that place the better. However, as he retreated, Atu suddenly felt his body jerk. It was as if his buttocks had bumped into an incomparably thick wall. It was startled for a moment and turned its head to look. At the same time, a faint and gloomy wind blew over again with a sky full of dust, covering the sky and the sun. Behind the sandstorm, right in front of Atu, a figure the size of a small mountain suddenly appeared. Because of the dust, the appearance of this enormous creature could not be seen, but Atu's figure seemed especially small under the shadow of that black shadow. Atsu's eyes widened, and it stared blankly at the huge figure. And in the sandstorm, the huge monster also seemed to feel something, and it slowly turned its head. A black shadow covered the sky and covered the puppy in its shadow. A huge head descended from the sky. Before Atu could see it clearly, he first saw a pair of eyes that were as huge as copper bells. They seemed to flicker with a terrifying light and shadow. The eyes slowly descended from the sandstorm and stared at Atu. Atsu let out a cry and its limbs became weak. With a plop, it directly fell to the ground. Luchin walked in the sandstorm, silently moving forward. The barren valley was filled with a strange and desolate atmosphere, as well as an invisible but abnormal feeling of chaos. But strangely, he seemed to be completely unaffected by it. When he gradually reached the center of the desolate valley, the terrain of the valley became even more chaotic. There were large and small cracks everywhere on the ground, crisscrossing each other. It was a ghastly sight. It was as if a terrible natural disaster had happened here a long time ago, and a powerful force had wreaked havoc here, leaving this valley with eternal marks of pain. And under his feet, the color of the ground gradually changed from the lifeless lead gray color at the beginning, began to become scorched black and dark red marks, and the deeper he went into the valley, the darker the two colors became, giving a strange illusion. It was as if this barren valley was also alive, but at some time, it was stabbed by a knife, and endless blood flowed out. After the blood dried up, it became such an ugly and terrible appearance. All these terrible blood stains appeared to be radiating outwards, and the source of all this was the circular open space in the center of the valley. Luchin slowly walked to this place. The sandstorm blew past him, sweeping up the lapels of his clothes, causing them to float slightly. In his line of sight, as the sandstorm slowly settled, a figure appeared in the ring. That person was not standing but sitting there, but even though he was just sitting, he looked as tall as an ordinary person standing. He sat in the circular open space, which seemed to be the source of all pain, horror, and devastation, and also the source of all power, with his back facing Luchin, looking at this side of the world. After a while, the sandstorm rose again and his figure became a little blurred. In the wind, a voice came, gentle and calm, sounding very similar to Luchen's usual tone. "You're here?" Chapter 76. Lu Qin stood 10 feet away from that person, his eyes looking at the back of the figure in front of him with a complicated expression. Even though there was still sand and dust drifting in the air, but with the naked eye he could still see that the figure was very broad. Even if it was only in terms of width, that figure alone could be equivalent to 3 ordinary people. In other words, it was a fatty. A very very fat fatty, so fat that old Ma would immediately become thin in front of him, to the extent that he would become a small magician in the presence of a big magician. Perhaps after a long time of greeting, there was no reply from Lu Qin. The sitting figure with some difficulty slowly turned around, looked at Lu Qin, and then a smile seemed to be heard. He beckoned and said, "Come over." Heaven and earth suddenly held their breath, the sand and wind abruptly stilled. The desolate valley was instantly silent. In that circular open space, all the wind and sand seemed to suddenly freeze. Only a white and fat palm passed through the sand and wind, gently waving. After a moment, the tiny and seemingly omnipresent grains of sand in the air, like a silent winter rain, fell down with a pitter-patter. The sand and wind that separated the two people just like that suddenly disappeared. Lu Qin looked up. All around him was empty, but further away there was still sand and dust. Only in this place where they stood, it was as if a spherical pure land had been dug out from between heaven and earth. There was no wind, no sand, only the two of them. Great power could be seen in the small, going against heaven and earth to give birth to creation. That person, sitting on the ground, very very fat, bald head and big ears, kind eyebrows, a gentle and calm smile on his face, a pair of eyes bright and clear, but also seemed to have some vicissitudes of life, as if he had seen through the world. He sat cross-legged, his hands looked a lot longer than ordinary people, his large robe covered his body which was like a small mountain, looking like the legendary Maitreya Buddha smiling at the human world. "Sit." The man gently patted the ground in front of him, smiled and looked at Lu Qin. Lu Qin slowly walked over and stood in front of him. Even though one was standing while the other was sitting, the bald fatty's stature was not much shorter than Lu Qin's. One could imagine how tall and terrifying a giant he would be if he really stood up. Lu Qin's gaze was fixed on the bald fatty, but he had no intention of sitting down. Instead he stood there silently. Of course this was a little rude, but the bald fatty did not seem to mind. In fact, the gentle smile in his eyes deepened, as if he was looking at a stubborn and unruly child in his family. "I haven't seen you for 10 years. The bald fatty said with a sigh. "How have you been?" "Not good," Lu Qin said. The bald fatty nodded and said, "I think so too. It's been hard on you." Lu Qin sneered, probably too lazy to say anything more. He randomly found a place and sat next to the bald fatty, suddenly looking for me. "What's the matter?" The bald fatty's eyes turned, but he did not immediately answer Lu Qin's question. Instead he looked at the empty space and suddenly said, 10 years ago during the Battle of the Barren Valley were those people sitting here?" "Yes." Lu Qin was silent for a moment before responding. "Tell me about it." Lu Qin suddenly raised his head and stared at the bald fatty. He said in a deep voice, "What do you mean?" "Nothing, just curious." The bald fatty smiled and looked at Lu Qin with a gentle smile. His clear eyes seemed to be able to see into the depths of his heart. He said, "Why can't I ask about this?" The two men looked at each other in the air for a while. After a moment, Lu Qin moved his eyes away and said lightly, "Yes. Yun Shouyang sits here." Lu Qin stood up and walked 6 feet in front of the bald fatty. He calmly pointed to the ground and said, "Fat and thin elders, sit on his left and right." Then he walked a few steps forward and came to the middle. He stamped his feet and said, "This is the Eye of the God subduing spell." "What about me? Is there anyone sitting here?" the bald fatty asked. Lu Qin glanced at him and said, "Yes, it's that barbarian shaman." The bald fatty nodded, and there was a hint of emotion in his expression. He said, "The fire shaman is one of the 7 great shamans in the ancient inheritance of the southern border barbarian tribe. He has a powerful supernatural power. If he was at his peak, even I think he would be a big problem." "You've done well." For the first time, the bald fatty stopped smiling and straightened his face. He quietly looked at Lu Qin and said, "The world is blessed, the righteous path of the divine prefecture is blessed." "Really?" Lu Qin suddenly asked. After these 3 words, suddenly no one spoke, and the surroundings suddenly became silent. The thick dark clouds above their heads slowly rolled. Suddenly, there seemed to be a faint sound of thunder coming from the depths of the clouds, and the wind and clouds rolled. And in the middle of the barren valley the two people looked at each other. This time, Lu Qin looked directly into the man's eyes. It was a pair of clear and pure eyes, but as deep as the sea, they seemed to be able to envelop the world, contain all things and reflect countless scenes. At this moment, in the depths of those eyes, there seemed to be thunder and lightning flashing above the dark clouds in the sky. Really? The bald fatty suddenly smiled, then looked at Lu Qin and said slowly, "Are you questioning me, disciple?" At the edge of the barren valley, Black Dog Atu was already scared out of its wits by the gigantic creature's side, especially when it saw the gigantic head turn around and slowly lean down. When the pair of terrifying glowing eyes came closer, Atu's entire body trembled in fear. From this enormous figure, there was an unusually powerful aura that caused Atu to feel reverence and fear from the bottom of his heart. It was even to the extent that at this moment, he was practically unable to even let out a wail, and he could only lie on the ground and shiver. The wind blew and stopped and the dust drifted down. A huge head slowly emerged from behind the wind and stretched out in front of Atsu. Atsu felt that one of the eyes on this huge head might be bigger than its own head, so it could not even see what kind of monster it was. After the huge shadow glanced at Atu, it stared at him for a moment and then let out a low moo. It seemed to be disdainful, but it also seemed to be uninterested. Then it lazily turned its head back. It was also at this moment that Atsu finally calmed down, and it finally saw the figure in front of it clearly. It was a huge oxen lying on the edge of the stone wall. His body was very large, like a small mountain. However, the strangest thing was that on the head of this oxen, there were two giant horns. The horns were as smooth as jade, and faintly shone with spiritual light. Chapter 77. In the center of the valley, the atmosphere was a little stiff and no one spoke for a long time. Lu Qin stood in the middle of the circle and slowly turned around to look at his surroundings. All he could see was a desolate scene. However, in his eyes, there seemed to be another scene that was so hot that it was suffocating. It was a burning flame, a huge pillar of light that fell from the sky, a magnificent power that could split the heavens and the earth, and a light shadow that shattered into countless pieces like a nightmare. Along with it, there was also the pain of the black flame that seemed to be engraved in the depths of his soul and would never be forgotten. "I'm not your disciple." Lu Qin suddenly smiled. Looking at the bald fatty, he said calmly, "You're the high and mighty perfected Lord Tianlan, who is respected by all, and I'm just a shadow in a dark corner." After he said that, the expression of the bald fatty, who had a dignified and imposing manner that seemed to be able to swallow the world, or rather, the legendary figure perfected Lord Tianlan, suddenly changed. He lowered his head slightly, and there seemed to be a touch of pain in the depths of his eyes. After a while, he smiled bitterly and said, "Do you hate me in your heart?" Lu Qin shook his head slowly with a complicated expression, as if recalling something from the past. He said, "I don't think so. It's just that I often have nightmares over the years. I dream that I killed a lot of people. I dream that the ground is covered with fire and blood, and I dream that there are mountains of corpses and seas of blood." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned, and a strange expression flashed across his face. He asked, "What happened?" After a moment of silence, Lu Qin looked up at him and said, "Back then, after I secretly destroyed the god-vanquishing spell here, the black flame curse immediately took effect and burned my flesh and soul. I was in great pain and my mind became muddled. I only vaguely remember that I walked out of the valley, and there seemed to be a fight in the middle. The bloody scenes in my dreams seemed to be from that time." "You didn't remember wrongly?" Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly interrupted him and said indifferently, "The plan that we made that day was to cooperate with each other from the inside. After you destroyed the god-vanquishing spell in the valley, Zheng Xianming's army launched a fierce attack from outside. Because most of the elites of the Three Realms Fiend cult were gathered here, the battle was extremely tragic. The mountains of corpses and seas of blood you saw were probably the scene at that time." Lu Qin was stunned, as if he didn't expect Perfected Lord Tianlan to be so direct. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Is that so? Then I dreamed that I killed a lot of people." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "No. You fainted not long after you left the valley and was saved by someone. You didn't fight for long." "You didn't fight. You didn't have fighting at all. Of the battle that year. You saw." Lu Qin was silent for a long time, but the gloominess on his face gradually lessened and he seemed to be more relaxed. After a while he let out a long breath. Perfected Lord Tianlan sighed softly and said, "It's my fault. If I could meet you once in all these years, maybe you wouldn't be so sad." Lu Qin shook his head and said, "It's none of your business. Oh right, Elder Yun Shouyang of the Fiend cult had a son and a daughter. The son's name was Yun Jian and the daughter was Yun Shaoqing. Do you know what happened to them? Perfected Lord Tianlan pondered for a moment and said, they died in that battle. Lu Qin hesitated for a moment and said, how did they die? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and said, when Zheng Xianming's army besieged the valley, they resisted stubbornly with other evildoers of the fiend cult and killed many of our cultivators. They were killed in the battle. They died in the battle? Yes. Lu Qin was silent again. After a while he suddenly shook his head and sighed. Then, he looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and his eyes seemed to have regained some of their original brightness. He said, all right, after saying so much nonsense, you still haven't told me why you're looking for me. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said, that's right. A good man should face life with a smile. Lu Qin snorted and said, easy for you to say. If you're capable, let the black fire burn for 10 years before saying that. As he spoke he was still a little indignant. He cursed under his breath and said in a low voice, damn fatty. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and shook his head, as if he did not hear that complaint. He said, I do have something that I need your help with. What is it? Go to the Kunlun party and find an evildoer of the fiend cult that has been in hiding for many years. 5 years ago, one of my secret agents in Fuyunji accidentally discovered a certain stronghold of the fiend cult in the Immortal City. Then, under Shui Ying's leadership, Fuyunji put in a lot of effort and finally sent people to infiltrate it. However, after the battle in the valley, the fiend cult that was greatly weakened became more cautious and the infiltrators could not get close to the core. Until a month ago, we suddenly received a secret letter from him, saying that he had already found out that the fiend cult was secretly setting up a great conspiracy and the person in charge was a fiend cult elder. When Lu Qin heard this, his pupils suddenly constricted. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him indifferently and continued, however, things suddenly changed at this point. The people of the devil cult suddenly noticed this and immediately counterattacked. We also tried our best to help but we were still a step too late. That person is dead. Before he died he only said 2 things to me. 1. There is a spy of the fiend cult in the Immortal Alliance and his position is extremely high. 2. The fiend cult has a great plan but there is a key person in their plan who is still hiding in the Kunlun party. We don't know his intentions but once that person completes the mission, the fiend cult will definitely succeed. The severity of the disaster is even greater than the disaster of the god-subduing curse in the valley. The valley became quiet again. For a long time the two of them did not speak. After a while Lu Qin said softly, why me? It's not like you don't know that the black flame curse has almost destroyed my cultivation. Now I am not much different from a mortal. Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, in this kind of matter, cultivation is not the most important. Even 10 or 100 Jindan Friar may not be able to compare to you. Lu Qin smiled bitterly. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, actually I don't need to say something and you will also understand. Zheng Xianming is now too powerful, bloated and incompetent. The spy in a high position that the Death Warrior said is indeed possible. Since that is the case, everything that starts from Zheng Xianming will be like a sieve, we can't continue. To do this we must find a person who even Zheng Xianming does not know. Lu Qin laughed self-deprecatingly and said, then it will be me? But don't forget, the remnants of the fiend cult are still searching for the whereabouts of that black wolf? But they can't find it. Perfected Lord Tianlan said lightly, there are only 2 people in the world who really know your identity. And other than you, I can't think of anyone else who knows the origins, cuts, codes, history, habits and all kinds of secret matters of the 3 realms divine sect like the back of his hand. To find that deeply hidden evildoer of the fiend cult, only you can do it. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Qin with a solemn expression and said word by word. Chapter 78. Lu Qin remained silent for a long time before he asked in a soft voice, you trust me that much? Perfected Lord Tianlan said, the demons of the devil cult are as cunning as foxes and they are everywhere. But if I had to choose someone who would never conspire with the devil cult, I would only trust you. I don't want to go. Lu Qin said. Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and asked, why? Lu Qin raised his head to look at him and said, in these 10 years, every time the black fire burns my body, I feel like I'm better off dead. When I think of all the things I've done in the past, the wind blades, the frost swords, and the blood on my hands, I sometimes wonder if all the suffering I've endured was worth it. For the people of the world or for the righteous path. Lu Qin's face was a little bleak as he said, you told me these words since I was young. I believed it and did it. But now I feel that this idea is quite meaningless. He looked at perfected Lord Tianlan and said word by word, "What does the people of the world and the righteous path have to do with me? Why should I risk my life and suffer for those people I don't know and have nothing to do with?" Lu Qin looked at perfected Lord Tianlan quietly and said, "Not to mention me, aren't you the same? All these years, you are the one who suppressed the devil cult the most in Zhengxianming, but what about the others? Aren't they all muddling along and living a befuddled life? How many people laugh at you behind your back for giving up your leisurely celestial life and insist on tormenting others? Not only that, there are probably countless people who hate and blame you just because you refuse to give in and block their path to wealth. Among them, there are even a few perfected lords with the same status as you." Perfected Lord Tianlan sighed and said, "Are you saying that it's a thankless task for me?" "Yes." Lu Qin said, "Why do you ask for trouble? With your current status in cultivation realm, no matter how arrogant the people of the devil cult are, as long as you don't go against them, they won't dare to provoke you easily. Even if they harm the world, they won't implicate you. Isn't that right?" Perfected Lord Tianlan fell silent. After a while, he suddenly laughed and said, "What you said seems to make sense." Lu Qin said, "Of course." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Are you done?" "I'm done." Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a moment and said, "Little Lu, listen to me. A real man is born between heaven and earth. Don't always be calculative. You have to broaden your horizons. As the saying goes, set your heart for heaven and earth, set your life for the people, continue learning for the saints and establish peace for all ages. Open your head." Lu Qin scolded, "Damn Baldy, what are you pretending for? You were originally a good fatty, but after saying that, you immediately became as stupid as a pig. Do you understand the meaning of these words? It's probably that when you read between the lines, you feel especially impressive. When you say it, you feel as if you're floating in the air, thinking that you're a cut above others, right? Let me tell you, stop putting on an act in front of me. You only know how to deceive people who don't read much." Perfected Lord Tianlan was not angry. Instead he smiled. "You've been in a bad temper recently. I've already told you those grand principles 10 years ago. Do you mean that you don't want to listen anymore?" Lu Qin said, "I don't want to listen anymore, it's annoying. Let's put it another way. Look at how long the world is. You and I are born in this world and there are always some things that have to be done. Even if there are millions of people, I'll still go forward. A real man is hot-blooded for the people of the world. Hey, what do you mean by waving that finger at me?" Lu Qin scoffed coldly and retracted his middle finger. "Damn Baldy, if you say such nonsense again, I'll spit on you." Perfected Lord Tianlan rubbed his shiny bald head, looking a little awkward. Then he smiled. "I'm used to it. You know, back in Zhengxianming, I had to coax those simple-minded young people to work for the righteous path of the world. I had to say that." "Scram." Lu Qin interrupted him rudely. "Is there a single word of truth? I'll let it slide if you lie to me to work for you for 10 years. If you don't say it now, I'm leaving." "Say what?" "Speak human language. Give me a reason, why do the two of us not want to live a comfortable life and must fight to the death against the evil cult, this kind of vicious and evil people? Can I not say it?" "No." Boom. Suddenly there was a loud sound. It was perfected Lord Tianlan who slapped the ground beside him. Instantly, a dragon roar and tiger roar could be heard from deep underground. The ground trembled and a few foot-wide cracks appeared. Cracking sounds spread in all directions as countless gravel flew into the air. "All right, I'll say it." Perfected Lord Tianlan's smile disappeared and his robes fluttered without any wind. Suddenly, his aura skyrocketed like a god or a demon. Looking at him, there was an illusion that he was indomitable. He shouted loudly, "I've King hated those idiots from the three realms for a long time." His shout was like thunder exploding in the sky. Immediately, dark clouds rolled in the horizon and the sky changed color. Thunder rumbled from afar and the wind and clouds surged in the vast valley. The sound echoed from the surrounding cliffs as if the entire world was echoing that sentence. Lu Qin frowned and shook his head. His ears were still ringing non-stop, and even his head was faintly aching. It could be seen that the power of that soul formation true monarch's angry shout just now was truly terrifying. After a while, when the roar in his head gradually calmed down, he looked up at perfected Lord Tianlan with a strange expression. "Just because of this?" Perfected Lord Tianlan harumphed coldly with a straight face. "These fools are always stirring up trouble. For the sake of some weird idea of unifying the three realms, they're going all out and causing trouble, causing us no peace. I've always liked the world to be peaceful since I was born. I like the skies to be clear and the people to live in peace. I'll look down on the common people to prove the great Tao of immortality. In the end, I was almost annoyed to death by them. Since they're making me unhappy, shouldn't I kill them? Lu Chen looked at the bald fatty for a long time and suddenly laughed. It's been 10 years and you've become so vulgar. Where's the majestic aura of a soul formation perfected lord? Perfected Lord Tianlan spat. It's all because I was angered by you, my traitorous disciple. Lu Chen waved it off. Don't say that. Back then, you told me clearly that you didn't acknowledge me as your disciple after I joined the fiend cult. Even if I die in front of you, I'll just die on my own. Perfected Lord Tianlan froze for a moment and suddenly fell silent. After a while, he sighed and said in a low voice, "You still remember it so clearly." Lu Chen did not reply and merely said, "Cut the crap. What do I get out of working for you this time round?" Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled. "Although I don't like fiend cults, eradicating them is for the sake of all living beings in the world. Isn't it a little inappropriate for you to ask for benefits out of the blue?" Lu Chen snorted disdainfully and said, "Is there?" "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlan straightened his body and expression. After pondering for a moment, he looked at Lu Chen and said in a deep voice, "Apart from you, I have no other successor in my life. Now that this is over, I'll let you acknowledge your ancestors and join my Kunlun sect." Lu Chen harumphed and did not say anything. "I'll impart everything I've learned to you. Everything I have will belong to you. I truly feel guilty for the sufferings you've suffered in the past. Once this is over, I'll allow you to walk out of the shadows and stand in the light of the world. From then on, you'll be able to hold your head high and become a righteous disciple of a famous sect. Even if it's that 5,000-year-old Kunlun sect, as long as you have the opportunity, luck, and strength in the future, this old man will do his best to help you rise to the top. Why can't I hand over this famous sect to you?" At this point, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly stood up. He was actually a shoulder taller than an ordinary person and his figure was strangely majestic. He looked like a mountain as he said word by word, "How about this?" Lu Chen frowned but still did not say anything. Chapter 79. After a long silence in the valley, Lu Chen sighed and said, "I'll agree to it." Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his brows and revealed a gratified smile. "Really? That's great. But I thought you wouldn't agree so easily." Lu Chen said indifferently, "The world is full of hardships and unfairness. For the sake of the people in the world, for the sake of the righteous path in the world, there are some things that have to be done." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "How did you become like this after 10 years? You have a bright future. I learned all this nonsense from you." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "Those guys are always after me. I've been hiding for 10 years and I'm tired of hiding. I might as well take this opportunity to destroy them and get rid of all future troubles." This time, it was Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes that flashed with surprise. "How can you be so sure that we can take this opportunity to destroy the fiend cult of the Three Realms?" Lu Chen smiled faintly. "I've been in the fiend cult for too long and I'm too familiar with their methods. Those fellows are all lunatics. Every single one of them wants to do something, but once they do, they want to do something that will shake the world and shake the earth." He glanced at Perfected Lord Tianlan and narrowed his eyes. His eyes gradually revealed a trace of coldness as though he had returned to the black-robed youth whose hands were stained with blood. He said coldly, 10 years ago, 3 out of 5 elders of the fiend cult were killed in the battle with the god-vanquishing curse. Now they're plotting something big again. According to what you said, the consequences are even worse than the god-vanquishing curse. As such, we have to gather the strength of the entire fiend cult for us to have any hope. Since that's the case, isn't this our chance? Perfected Lord Tianlan took a deep look at Lu Chen. His eyes were as bright as a blade. He paced back and forth and nodded. "Makes sense." He then smiled. "Indeed, you're the only one who can deal with the fiend cult of the Three Realms." Lu Chen snorted coldly and did not reply. After a moment of silence, he said, "However, I still have a few things to tell you when I go to Kunlun." "Speak." Lu Chen said, "How do I join the Kunlun party?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "I am a perfected lord from the Kunlun party. It's too easy for me to arrange for a nobody like you to enter this sect. Naturally, it'll be done without anyone knowing. Don't worry." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's good. However, the Kunlun party has a disciple in the Qi refining state, Hong Chuan. He came to Qingshiteng village where I live in seclusion and met me before. We even have some contacts. Maybe there are some hidden dangers? Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, I'll get someone to send him out to work first. He'll come back after a year or so. Yes. Luchin continued, do you have any idea what the devil cult demons lurking in the Kunlun party are planning? This time, Perfected Lord Tianlan pondered for a while, then shook his head and said, the Kunlun party is a famous sect with 5,000 years of history. Although I'm a perfected lord, I can't completely grasp the sect's secrets. Currently, I know nothing about that person, so I can't tell you anything. All right, Luchin smiled in a self-deprecating manner and said, anyway, it's not the first time, Perfected Lord Tianlan said. If there's nothing else, go find Xiao Ma and let him take you to Kunwa City first. I'll make arrangements later. Luchin nodded and turned to leave. However, after walking for about 10 feet, he suddenly heard Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice coming from behind. Oh yes, there's something I've wanted to ask you for a long time. Luchin turned to look at the unusually tall bald fatty and said, what is it? Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him and said slowly, you joined the devil cult when you were young and hid for many years. During this period you lived with the devil cult demons day and night. Do you know any close friends? Luchin was silent for a while as if he was recalling the past. Then he looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan's calm but unfathomable eyes. His expression did not change and he said calmly, no. On the other side of the valley at the edge of the stone wall, a huge jadehorn green bull was lazily kneeling on the ground, and beside it, the pitifully small black dog Atu was cowering and hiding at the side. Seeing that Oxen had been lazy since the beginning and didn't seem to want to pay attention to it, Atsu finally calmed down a little after its initial panic. When Oxen turned its head back and seemed to be dozing off again, Atsu shrunk its body and slowly moved backward bit by bit. Its movements were particularly cautious, as if it was afraid of making the slightest sound and startling this huge monster. However, it was somewhat unfortunate that although Atsu retreated quietly at this moment, a thunderous roar suddenly came from the center of the vast valley. Have long disliked, for a long time. The roaring sound waves seemed to have substance, instantly sweeping up millions of dust and sand. Like a storm, it swept over and heavily smashed against the hard stone wall. Atu was actually shocked, and immediately after he suddenly cried out in fear. It was because his body was blown by a gust of wind that came out of nowhere, and the force actually swept his entire body into the air, and then he was about to smash into the stone. At this critical moment, a huge shadow suddenly approached from the storm of dust and sand. Then a thick rope-like object flew over and directly wrapped around Atsu in midair. Just as this little black dog was about to hit the hard stone wall and break its head and bleed, it was forcibly pulled back. Atsu barked wildly. Its four legs struggled desperately, but at this moment, it could not control itself. It was directly pulled to the other side of the sandstorm, and a moment later, it fell heavily to the ground. After a while, the sudden roar disappeared, and the inexplicable strange wind also disappeared. Only then did Atsu realize that it had fallen back to the side of the huge oxen, and the thing that had just saved it seemed to be this oxen's tail. Oxen's thick and long tail swung behind it and retracted. Then, its huge head turned to look at this little dog and then it turned back expressionlessly. It seemed that the action just now for this rare oxen was just a small effort that it did when it was in a good mood. It was not worth mentioning at all. Atsu lay on the ground in a daze for a while. Suddenly it barked, jumped up and ran away. Oxen seemed to be a little surprised. It looked back and saw that the dog was running away in a panic. After watching for a while, it swung its tail again and let out a low moo. Atsu ran all the way and it didn't take long to run back to the entrance of the valley. Only then did it stop to catch its breath. After a while Luchin also came out. Atsu quickly leaned over and used its head to rub against Luchen's leg. Luchin seemed to have something on his mind. He did not notice anything wrong with Atsu. He just gently touched its head with his hand and continued to walk out. Atsu looked back in that direction, barked twice, shook its head and ran away with Luchin. Chapter 80. Do you know, sometimes I'm very suspicious of your identity and background? On the hillside outside the valley, two people and a dog sat together. Luchin grabbed a drumstick that Old Ma handed to him and ate it. At the same time he mumbled something. Somehow, Old Horse had brought a lot of food with him. At this time he took them all out and even grabbed a meat bone and threw it to Atu. This made the black puppy so happy that it lay on the side and gnawed happily. The sound of chewing could be heard continuously. This puppy is not bad, but it's lame, Old Ma sighed and then turned to Lu Qin and said, "What did you say just now?" Lu Qin didn't even look at him and murmured again. Old Ma sneered and said, "I have a clean background and I'm loyal and courageous. What are you doubting?" Lu Qin glanced at him and sneered, "I've seen through you in the past 10 years. You're fat, ugly and stupid. You can't even do business or cultivate. Hey." Old Ma said angrily, "Bastard, it's fine if you say I'm fat, but how can you say I'm stupid? If I didn't protect you for the past 10 years, you would have died many times." Lu Qin ignored Old Ma's protest and continued to say, "You're stupid, fat and have low cultivation. But for more than 10 years the famous Lord Tianlan didn't trust anyone and only let you hang out with me. If that damn baldy didn't lie and really values me as much as he does, then there must be something wrong with your identity." He looked at Old Ma with interest and clicked his tongue. "Why does he trust a useless person like you so much? Are you the bastard son of that damn baldy?" Old Ma was a little surprised. "Get out." Old Ma glared at him and said, "How dare you slander me when you're eating my food? Spit out the chicken." Lu Qin threw the chicken drumstick at him. Old Ma twisted his body and dodged it. "Hey, you're good at martial arts." Old Ma smiled proudly and said, "Of course these days Oh." Before Old Ma finished his words, he was interrupted by Lu Qin. He seemed to suddenly think of something and stared at Old Ma with a strange expression. He said, "That damn baldy is a super fat man, but you're just an ordinary fat man. Are you really a dissolute man left by that damn baldy when he was young?" "Bah." Old Ma said angrily, "If you talk nonsense again I'm going to fall out with you." Lu Qin laughed and clapped his hands. He reached out to Old Ma and said, "Do you have wine?" Old Ma threw a wine gourd over. Lu Qin caught it, opened the cork and took a big gulp. Then he let out a long breath and said, "Good wine." Old Ma looked at him. Gradually his eyes softened. After a while he sighed and said, "Have you really thought it through? It's hard to say whether this trip to Kunlun will be a blessing or a curse." Lu Qin smiled and looked at Old Ma. He said, "Shouldn't you help him and try to persuade me to go?" Old Ma shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter to me. Besides, I've stayed with you in that village for 10 years. To be honest, I don't want you to take the risk." Lu Qin was silent for a moment. Then he said indifferently, "I've thought about it. I want to go." Old Ma nodded and didn't say anything else. When he stood up and was about to pack his things, he lightly patted Lu Qin's shoulder. Lu Qin smiled at him gently. When they were packing their things and preparing to leave, Lu Qin asked Old Ma, "After leaving Qingshitang village, where have you been? What have you been doing?" Old Ma didn't care about his image. He pulled up his waistband and patted his chubby belly. Then he walked along the mountain path with Lu Qin and said, "I've been recuperating. After I've recuperated, I went to Kunwa City and opened a small shop." Lu Qin paused and looked at him with a strange expression. He said, You've been preparing for this for a long time?" Old Ma said indifferently, "I can't say that I've been preparing for a long time. But since I had nothing to do anyway, I thought you'd definitely have a bad relationship with the Kunlun party in the future, so I just ran to Kunwa City. It'd be weird if I believed you." Lu Qin sneered and walked forward. However, a complicated light seemed to flash in the depths of his eyes. Atu ran past the two of them, shaking his head and wagging his tail excitedly. It was just that he was limping due to his leg injury, which made him look very awkward. Old Ma looked at it for a while and said to Lu Qin, "What's the matter with this puppy?" Lu Qin said, "I picked it up on the road a few days ago." Old Ma was a bit surprised. He said, "Huh? Has your temperament changed? Has your heart softened?" Lu Qin said, "No, I just thought that if I'm hungry and can't find anything to eat, I'll eat dog meat to stave off my hunger." Old Ma said, "Just pretend I didn't say that." Lu Qin said, "Right, since you've settled down in Kunwa City, I presume that with your means, you must have investigated a lot about the Kunlun party. Let me ask you something. Have there been any particularly outstanding young disciples in the Kunlun party recently?" Old Ma smiled complacently. Soon after, he pondered with rapt attention for a while and said, "The Kunlun party is a famous and large sect. It has many disciples and outstanding talents. Now that you've asked me this question, I don't know what to say. There are many candidates." Lu Qin thought for a while and said, "A few days ago, somewhere in this chaotic land, I met someone in the middle of the night." As he said this, he told Old Ma about the situation that happened that night. Then he said, "The moonlight slash is a Taoist technique that is extremely difficult to cultivate in Kunlun. It's difficult for people who aren't talented to cultivate it. Plus, the person was a young woman. Perhaps you know about it?" Old Ma frowned. After thinking carefully for a while, he shook his head and said, I know about the Moonlight Slash, but I really can't think of any young female Kunlun party disciple who could cultivate this technique in the past few years. Let's go back to Kunwa City first. I'll help you secretly inquire about it. It shouldn't be a big problem to find that person. As he said this, he paused and said, What's wrong? You haven't even seen that woman's face yet. Why are you suddenly so interested in her? Lu Qin smiled and put a finger in front of his eyebrows. Then he slowly moved forward and lightly touched his forehead a few times. He said calmly, That night, the tip of her sword was right here. If it was just a little bit further forward, it would probably have pierced through my head. The smile on old Ma's face suddenly faded a bit. He raised his eyes and looked at Lu Qin with a faintly worried expression. However, Lu Qin continued to talk without any change in his expression. He only said indifferently, It's been many years since someone pointed a sword at my head like this. Woof 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 woof. The Atsa dog in front of them had already run far away. It turned its head and barked at the two of them, seemingly urging them to hurry up. Lu Qin quickened his pace. At the same time he calmly said, Find her. Old Ma nodded. He sighed and said, All right, I understand. Chapter 81. The Kunlun party got its name from the mountain. The entire sect was built on the Kunlun mountain range, which had the reputation of being the most famous mountain in the western continent. 5,000 years ago, a cultivator, Kun Yuanzi and Tai Luo, traveled the world. They passed by the western continent's Kunlun mountain range. It was a time of chaos. The spiritual mountain was covered in dust and there were countless bandits. They killed and looted all day long, turning the area within 1,000 miles into a hell of water and fire. However, one night there was a sudden change in the sky. Kun Yuanzi and Tai Luo both saw a huge star fall from the sky and fall into the mountain. That night, the mountain range trembled. Strange lights soared into the sky, and spiritual energy shrouded the mountains and covered the sun like clouds. In the following days, strange things happened around the Kunlun mountain. It snowed in the summer and women took over the morning. The land trembled several times a day, and there were signs of mountains collapsing and the earth cracking. The weather was also unpredictable. What's more, strange demons, ghosts, and demonic beasts appeared in the back of the mountain. They were ferocious and valiant. Although there weren't many of them, they often captured people for food. The people of the world were terrified and fled the mountain. No matter where they were, they all said that a great demon had appeared in the mountain, and that it would bring disaster to the world and slaughter all living things. Kunlun Mountain would become a sea of blood. However, Kun Yuanzi and Tai Luo had unique insight. They thought that this mountain was a supreme spiritual vein in the world and the foundation of a great cause. They bowed to the heavens and made a great vow. They were willing to become the master of the spiritual mountain. After that, the two of them used their great divine abilities to stabilize the world, slay demons, expel bandits, and appease the common people. During this period, their sincerity moved the heavens, and they obtained a great fortune in the depths of the spiritual mountain. They saw the immemorial immortal mansion. They obtained an ancient immortal jade book that passed down a peerless immortal technique. It was also said that there was a resplendent treasure light and a supreme immortal weapon. Since the fortune had arrived, there was nothing more to say. The two ancestors established a sect on this Kunlun mountain, accepted disciples, and established a great cause that would not last for 10,000 generations. This was the Kunlun party of today. The Kunlun party had been passed down for 5,000 years. Outstanding people had emerged in large numbers. The Kunlun party had always flourished in the world of human cultivators, which was truly an anomaly. The Kunlun party was founded 2,000 years earlier than Zhengxiameng. It could be said to be the well-deserved #1 sect in the cultivation world today. However, talented people emerged in every generation, and the new generation surpassed the old. In today's incomparably prosperous cultivation age, the human cultivation world was thriving. Countless geniuses and outstanding talents emerged one after another, and cultivation sects, large and small, were springing up like bamboo shoots after a rain. In terms of strength and prestige alone, the cultivation world of the divine central continent was already filled with heroes, and there was no longer a situation where one sect dominated. Today's Kunlun party had gone through 5,000 years of trials and hardships. It had already taken over the vast Kunlun mountain range as its private property. There were no less than 10,000 of its direct disciples who had achieved success in cultivation, and there was even a deity transformation stage true lord who had exceedingly high Taoist magic presiding over the sect. It could be said that it had an illustrious reputation and sat firmly on the throne of a famous sect. In addition, the Kunlun party also had disciples in the Qi refining realm who had just caught a glimpse of the door, as well as many miscellaneous disciples. There were even more people in this area, more than 100,000 in total. Such a large sect was also a behemoth in the vast western continent. Corresponding to it was Kunwu City at the foot of Kunlun Mountain SX. For thousands of years, it had gradually become one of the most prosperous and largest cities in this vast area. Have you been here before? When Old Ma and Lu Qin walked into this big city and walked in the bustling Kunwu City with tall buildings, Old Ma asked Lu Qin. Lu Qin nodded and said, I've been here before. Old Ma was a bit surprised and said, When? You've been with me for the past 10 years and before that you were working. When did you get here? Lu Qin's gaze swept over the spacious and flat streets of Kunwu City and said, I was probably 5 or 6 years old. I don't remember too clearly. Old Ma was startled and asked, What happened? Lu Qin said, I came to look for food. There are many people here so I can find a lot of food in the garbage. Old Ma was silent. After a long time he said, What happened next? Lu Qin smiled and said, I don't know how much time has passed, but that damn Baldy suddenly appeared in front of me. He said he would let me eat my fill and wear my clothes. He told me to go with him so I went with him. Old Ma sighed and seemed to want to say something, but Lu Qin suddenly turned around and waved his hand. He shouted with a smile, Atsu, keep up. There are so many people here. If you get lost you won't be able to find us. Woof woof woof. After a few barks, the lame black dog quickly ran over from the crowd behind them and affectionately rubbed against Lu Qin's feet. On the way from the land of chaos to Kunwu City, Atsu seemed to have grown a bit. It was unknown whether it was because Old Ma brought a lot of food so this gluttonous dog ate as much as it could every day. Where's your shop? Lu Qin patted Atsu's head and turned to ask Old Ma, Is it on this street? Old Ma glanced at the bustling street filled with shops and said without changing his expression, It's tasteless to open a shop in such a vulgar and noisy place. Come with me. Lu Qin immediately had a whole new level of respect for Old Ma. I haven't seen you for a while, but you've actually developed taste. Fiske. Old Ma snorted disdainfully. He put his chubby hands behind his back and walked forward like a rich man. Lu Qin and Atsu followed behind him and walked down the street. They walked down another street. They walked down another street. After walking down another street. Another street. Lu Qin couldn't help but call out to the fat man who was already sweating profusely. He looked at him suspiciously and said, Are we not there yet? Why do I feel like we're almost out of the city? Old Ma stopped and wiped the beads of sweat from his forehead. He glanced at the towering city wall in front of him and laughed, Soon, soon. As he said this he walked forward for a while and suddenly turned to the side. He walked into an alley by the side of the road. After walking for 2 or 3 feet, a wooden door appeared in front of them. Lu Qin stood in the alley and looked around. He saw that the place was deserted and there was no trace of anyone. It was a world of difference from the bustling streets that they had walked through before. On top of the wooden door, there was a signboard with 3 words written on it. Black Hill Pavilion. Do you have any business in this place? Lu Qin couldn't help but ask Old Ma. Old Ma sneered and said, What do you know? There's an old saying, fragrant wine needs no dark alley. Do you know that? As he said this he took out a key and unlocked the door of the house. He led Lu Qin inside and said, Besides, this place has a lot of benefits. In this noisy city, it's the best place to find peace and quiet. Walk 2 streets north and you'll reach the exit of the city gate. Walk 2 streets south and you'll reach the mansions of the influential families in the city. It's such a good place, but the price of the house can't even compare to a month's rent for an ordinary shop on the street in the center of Kunwu City. When I came here that day I thought about it for a bit and decided to buy this house. In the future, it can be regarded as an ancestral property of my Old Ma family. After saying this Old Ma looked complacent. He looked around and then looked at Lu Qin. He said with a smile, What do you think? Lu Qin said, If you don't have money just say it. What's with all this nonsense? Chapter 82. Old Ma said, Big brother, poor people also have dignity. They also need to live. Lu Qin snorted and said, Living is living. Who are you trying to fool with all that extravagant talk? Old Ma said seriously, Although we are poor, we also need to have dreams, right? If you think about this place better, you will feel that this place is really not bad. Lu Qin shook his head and was speechless. He turned around and shouted, Atsu. Atsu barked and ran over, following Lu Qin and Old Ma inside. This house was actually not too small. It had 2 entrances facing the street. Well, facing the alley was a front hall. Old Ma had made a counter. It seemed that he wanted to make it look like a shop. Behind it was a small courtyard. It was not big, but it was square with a walkway on both sides. There were 2 more rooms at the back. They were not too big, but they were enough for people to sleep in. Hey, it's not bad, Lu Qin said to Old Ma. Old Ma immediately became happy. He laughed and said, I'm not wrong, am I? It's barely okay to live here, but forget about doing business. You won't be able to make a lot of money. Lu Qin stood in the barren courtyard and casually said, I just need to plant some rocks, grass and 2 trees here. That should do it. Get lost. I don't have money to waste on those boring things. Lu Qin laughed and did not care. He asked casually, You just said that there are big families living in the city nearby? Old Ma scratched his head and said, Oh, actually it's not too close. It's about 2 streets away. Over there is the gathering place of the old mansions of the influential families in the city. Quite a few of them have close relationships with the Kunlun party, whether overtly or covertly. Lu Qin nodded. This was also a matter of course. Kunwa City was at the foot of Kunlun Mountain, and with such a huge Kunlun party entrenched here, no matter who it was, they would want to curry favor with this incomparably huge thigh. Old Ma walked into the inner room, opened one of the rooms and said, You can stay here for now. When the Immortals' side is ready, I will arrange for you to enter the Kunlun party directly. Lu Qin nodded and said, All right. At nightfall, Kunwa City gradually quieted down. The night breeze swept by and the lights of tens of thousands of households were lit. In an inconspicuous corner of the city, in a small house in a shabby alley, Old Ma and Lu Qin moved a small table and placed it in the courtyard. Then they each sat on a stool, brought a pot of wine, 2 cups and 3 plates of side dishes and chatted in the courtyard. A cold moon hung high in the night sky, its faint light sprinkling down, bestowing the small courtyard with a bit of light. However, under the eaves of the surrounding houses, there was only darkness. In the shadows, like a ghost, Atsu poked its head out of the dark corner of the corridor and carefully looked around. Then it wagged its tail and sniffed around the small courtyard before sneaking to a corner to pee. Only then did it run back to Lu Qin's side, stretched its body and lay down at Lu Qin's feet. Lu Qin casually picked up a chicken foot from the plate and tossed it over. Atsu didn't even get up. It just stretched its neck forward and caught it in one bite. Then it leaned against Lu Qin's feet and began to happily chew on it. Old Ma glanced at Atsu and said, When you go up the mountain in a few days, what about this black dog? Lu Qin picked up the wine pot and poured some wine into his cup. He said, I'll leave it with you for now. Once I settle down at the Kunlun party, I'll see if I can bring it up the mountain. Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, The spirited mountain of Kunlun is the world's #1 paradise. There are all kinds of celestial and auspicious beasts on the mountain. How can you bring a lame dog up there? Lu Qin rubbed his chin and said thoughtfully, Now that you mention it, I suddenly remember that when I was risking my life outside in the past, when I was in danger at the gates of hell, I had eaten quite a lot of the flesh and blood of the various demonic beasts. Only these legendary spiritual beasts of the immortals have never been seen before. Old Ma's face darkened. He glared at Lu Qin and said, Hey, you haven't even gone up the mountain and you're already thinking about whether the meat of the spiritual beasts on the mountain tastes good or not. That's not very good. Lu Qin smiled and said, I was just thinking about it. Old Ma looked at him suspiciously and said, But why do I feel like you're up to no good? Tsk, what a villain. Lu Qin threw away the topic disdainfully and said, How's the current situation in the Kunlun party? Tell me about it. Old Ma nodded and said, Now the huge Kunlun mountain range is already under the control of the Kunlun party. The spirited mountain range is continuous and undulating. Over the past thousands of years, countless immortal caves have been opened. But the most important place is the so-called spring, summer, autumn and winter peaks between the sky and clouds. They are in the depths of Kunlun and are suspended above the mountains. They are the world's #1 wonders. Legend has it that they were created by the fall of a star 5,000 years ago. Lu Qin nodded and said, I've also heard of the 4 floating peaks between the sky and clouds. Although I haven't seen them with my own eyes, I think they must be amazing wonders. Old Ma said, Not only that, it is said that the spiritual power on the 4 floating peaks is more than 10 times that of the mortal world. It is a natural holy land for cultivation. In the Kunlun party, except for the 2 perfected deity transformation, it is said that only Yuanying Jinren is qualified to set foot on these 4 strange peaks. Lu Qin raised his glass and clinked it with old Ma's. He said with a smile, I wonder if we will have the chance to go up and see in the future? Old Ma shrugged and said with a smile, I think we will have the chance to stand on the ground and look up for a few times. Lu Qin laughed and drank the wine in his glass. Then he said, tell me about those sections. Old Ma pondered for a moment and said, nowadays there are many heroes in the cultivation world. Although the Kunlun party can't be said to be second to none, it is still one of the top 5 sections. There are indeed many heroes in the sect. However, after you enter the sect in the future, you still have to pay attention to one thing. At this point his voice slightly lowered. He said, the Kunlun party has been passed down to this day, and its orthodoxy has never been broken. However, there were 2 founders in the past, Kuan Yuanzi and Tai Luo. Therefore, the orthodoxy that has been passed down over the years is actually divided into 2 factions. One is called Kuanji, and the other is called Tieji. Lu Qin frowned and said, why these 2 factions don't get along? Old Ma said, they are harmonious on the surface but not on the inside. Lu Qin nodded and said, could it be that they are secretly scheming against each other? Not at all. Old Ma smiled and said lightly. Lu Qin was startled for a moment, then he said with a smile, oh, this is strange. Old Ma said, there is nothing strange about it because the Tieji branch of the Kunlun party has been on the decline for many years. On the contrary, the Kuanji branch is growing stronger day by day. The 2 great perfected gods of the current Kunlun party, Tianlan and Bai Chen, are both from the Kuanji branch. Among the 19 Yuanying perfected ones, 15 are from the Kuanji branch. What do you think? Lu Qin said, oh, I see. No wonder the Tieji branch wants to tuck their tails between their legs. Old Ma laughed and said, who says it isn't? Originally, the Kuanji and Tieji legacies were divided equally among the spirited mountain of Kunlun. Not to mention other things, just the 4 strange peaks in the sky and clouds were 2 on each side. But now perfected Lord Tianlan has 1, Hakushin Jinkuan has 1, and the remaining 2 have been occupied by the 15 Yuanying perfected ones. If you were a disciple of the Tieji branch, what would you do? Lu Qin thought for a moment, then said with a smile, why not rebel? Chapter 83. Old Ma spat and looked at Lu Qin with disdain. He said, do you think you can rebel just because you say so? It's easy for you to say that. Lu Qin laughed and poured wine into their glasses again. He said, then what do you think we should do? Old Ma said sternly, if I were a disciple of Taiji's lineage, I wouldn't be able to defeat the Kuanji who have the advantage in numbers. Then I might as well admit defeat and behave myself. Besides, the 2 of us are saying alarmist words here. In fact, in the Kunlun party, the 2 groups of disciples may not really be like fire and water. No matter what, they are still Kunlun disciples of the same sect and ancestor. They just have some disputes on ordinary days. How big of a deal can it be? Lu Qin thought for a moment, then said, what you said makes sense. Perhaps in another 200 or 300 years the tables will turn. At that time the Iron Branch's strength will suddenly soar, suppressing the Kuanji branch. Old Ma laughed and said, isn't that so? Who knows what will happen in the future? Let's drink, let's drink. The 2 of them clinked their glasses and made a crisp sound. The black dog lying under the table looked up and then lowered its head to gnaw on the bone. Old Ma glanced at Lu Qin and said with a smile, speaking of which, in a few days I may go up the mountain to become a Kunlun disciple. At that time, everything will naturally be arranged by that person. I think he will not treat you too badly. Oh yes, as a disciple, it doesn't matter which branch you belong to. The most important thing is to be well informed and convenient. Lu Qin interrupted Old Ma's speech and said, you go tell the damn baldy that I want to be in Kuanji. If he dares to put me in Tieji, I will kill his oxen. Cough cough cough. Old Ma suddenly choked and coughed on the spot. There are a lot of influential clans in Kunwu City, and most of them are the descendants of experts who have achieved the Tao in the Kunlun party for several thousand years. They have been passed down from generation to generation, and they are inextricably linked to the Kunlun party. Old Ma pointed to the north and said, these big families and clans have 2 biggest advantages. First, they follow the Kunlun party wholeheartedly and become its claws, teeth, and eyes. I don't dare to say far away, but within a radius of 2,000 miles from Kunwu City, nothing can escape the Kunlun Party's grasp. Second, over the years, almost all the outstanding talents in these big families and clans have entered the Kunlun Party's tutelage, and many outstanding talents have emerged from them. Lu Qin nodded. Suddenly he frowned and said, "According to you, we can't hide from the Kunlun Party spies even if we come here?" Old Ma snorted and proudly said, "That's only for ordinary people. What kind of person am I, Old Ma Xiaoyun? No one can recognize me no matter what I do, not to mention that I have that person secretly watching over me. Don't worry, it'll be fine." Lu Qin laughed and said, "In any case, it's those children of influential clans who are powerful, right? We can't afford to offend them." Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, "Bullshit. At the end of the day, you brat, there's someone standing behind you, supporting you. Until now, that person still doesn't have a disciple, but he has an exceedingly powerful peerless divine ability. If you really shed all pretense of cordiality with him, even if all the influential families in Kunwu City joined hands, none of them would dare to oppose you." Lu Qin laughed and said, "Unfortunately, I can't have a falling out with him, so I can only endure, right?" Old Ma sternly said, "That's right. Then aren't you talking nonsense?" "I'm not talking nonsense." Old Ma solemnly said, "While you're suppressing your resentment, you can think to yourself, when I'm done with my business in the future, I'll come and settle the score with you. Let's see if you idiots who look down on others will kneel in front of me at that time." Lu Qin couldn't help but laugh and said, "You're really thinking too far ahead." Old Ma laughed mischievously and said, "Of course. All these years I've been so angry at you that my life has been shortened by 10 years. Every time didn't I secretly think like this to get through it?" Lu Qin extended a finger to him to show his respect, then he casually said, "Nowadays in the Kunlun Party who has a deep background and can't be provoked? Tell me all of them. In the future I'll stay away from them." Old Ma thought for a moment then said, "Right now, you have the air of a useless person on your face. At most you're only at the qi refining realm. The Kunlun Party is so big, and there are at least 80 to 90,000 people with higher cultivation than you. It seems like you can't provoke any of them." "Lu Qin," Old Ma said again, "Oh, but of course there are some who are especially powerful. You especially can't provoke them. People as powerful as spiritual master Yuanying and Jin Dan Friar can crush you with a finger. Their direct disciples are almost all elite disciples, so you should also stay away from them. As for the disciples of the aristocratic families, although there are many Kunwu aristocratic families, there will always be ups and downs. Right now the most powerful families are probably the Bai, Tai and Su clans. You should give in to them. As for the small aristocratic families that have declined, they actually don't matter." Lu Qin suddenly thought of something and asked, "Is there an aristocratic family with the surname Yi in this city? How strong is it? A clan?" Old Ma thought for a moment then said, "It's all right. These years I haven't heard of any powerful figures emerging from this family. It can't be considered one of the most powerful families, but it can't be said to have declined either. It can be considered average." "Why are you asking about it?" Lu Qin said, "Oh, it's nothing. I've seen a girl from this family before." He then told Old Ma about how he met Xin in the land of chaos. Old Ma frowned and said, "Why didn't you tell her about this?" Lu Qin said indifferently, "What would happen if I told her?" Old Ma didn't hesitate at all and said, "Of course I'd think of a way to avoid this flaw and not let her get in the way." Halfway through his sentence, Old Ma's voice suddenly dropped and his expression changed slightly. He glanced at Lu Qin, shook his head and sighed softly. He didn't say anything else. Lu Qin smiled and said, "Yes, don't let her get in the way." He lowered his head and looked at the wine cup in his hand. The amber wine trembled slightly in the cup. After a while he raised the cup and drank the wine. As the days passed, Lu Qin quietly stayed in the small courtyard. It could be said that he didn't go out at all. Fatty Old Ma went out a few times. He came and went in a hurry and no one knew what he was busy with. Even Black Dog sneaked out to stroll in the alley outside, but he quickly ran back. When he was bored, Lu Qin would sit behind the counter in the front hall when Old Ma went out. He said that he was helping Old Ma look after the shop. However, he soon realized how accurate his previous judgment was. For a whole 7 days, he didn't see a single customer come to the Black Hill Pavilion. On the morning of the 8th day, Old Ma very seriously told Lu Qin that there should be some progress in helping him infiltrate the Kunlun Party, and he would go out to do it. So, Lu Qin sat quietly behind the lonely counter and looked out the door at the quiet alley. Atsu lay directly in front of the door, enjoying the passing wind from the alley. Its tail wagged from time to time as if it was enjoying its dog life. Suddenly, there was a sudden sound of footsteps coming from the bluestone road in the alley outside. After a moment, a clear and melodious voice, like a wind chime gently swaying in the spring breeze, came from outside. Black Hill Pavilion? Ah, what a strange name. Chapter 84. The black dog suddenly pricked up its ears, then suddenly jumped up and stared at the door with its eyes shining. It bared its sharp fangs and let out a low growl from its throat, looking like it was about to bite someone. There was an exclamation from outside the house, but a moment later, a figure suddenly appeared at the door. It was Lu Qin. Lu Qin kicked the stupid dog to the ground and scolded, "Stupid dog! This is a guest. If you want to eat meat and bones in the future, you will have to rely on him. Do you want to die?" Woo woo. The low and fierce growl suddenly changed, and the ferocious aura on the black dog disappeared in the blink of an eye. It wagged its tail wildly and hummed in a low voice. It ran out of the door and circled the figure outside the door twice, shaking its head and wagging its tail without any integrity to speak of. Yeah. The person outside the house was shocked at first, then let out a sound of, "Ha!" but then burst out laughing. She covered her mouth and laughed. "Why is this dog so fun?" Lu Qin looked up and saw a young girl about 10 years old standing on the bluestone road outside the house. She had almond-shaped eyes and peach cheeks, and her skin was as white as snow. Although she had not grown up yet, from the looks of it, she would definitely be a stunning beauty in the future. At this moment, the little girl looked at the black dog jumping around beside her. She seemed to find it very interesting and she was full of smiles. There was a soft breeze blowing through the alley, and her red sleeves fluttered in the wind. At this moment, the spring breeze, the deep alley and the young girl, this scene was like a beautiful painting. Lu Qin called out to the stupid dog that was jumping around blindly. Then, his gaze fell on the girl's face, and he couldn't help but sigh in admiration in his heart. Although the girl in front of him wasn't very old, her complexion was truly the first time he'd seen someone with such a complexion. It could be said that she was born with a beauty that could cause the downfall of nations and people since she was young. "Miss, what's the matter?" Lu Qin asked the little girl politely, and at the same time, glanced into the distance of the alley. There was no one in the alley. She seemed to have come alone. The girl pointed at the signboard with the words, "Black Hill Pavilion," and asked, "Is this a shop?" Lu Qin was startled for a moment, then he turned around and said, "I guess so." The girl nodded with a smile and walked in. At the same time, a pair of bright and clear eyes looked at the simple things in the shop. She was a little curious and a little cautious. Lu Qin walked back to the counter and asked, "What do you want to buy?" "Yes." The young lady responded, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she glanced at the row of shelves behind the counter. There were some items on the shelves inside the store. Most of them were the most common and common spirit materials. They looked like they had been there for a long time because many places were covered in dust. After noticing that the girl's gaze had become a little strange, Lu Qin also turned around to look. When the scene on the shelves fell into his eyes, Lu Qin was also stunned for a moment. Then he turned around and smiled a little awkwardly, saying, "The owner of this shop is very lazy, I've let you see a joke." "Hey, are you not the shopkeeper of this Black Hill Pavilion?" the girl asked with some surprise and looked around. In this shop, it was obvious that only Lu Qin was looking after the shop. "I'm not the shopkeeper here," Lu Qin said seriously. "In fact, I am the uncle of the shopkeeper. Today he went out to buy goods, so I came to help look after the shop." "Oh, I see." The girl nodded as if she believed him. However, when she looked at the simple appearance of the shop, her face gradually revealed a difficult expression. Lu Qin asked with a smile, "What do you need?" "Tell me. If there is, I will show it to you. If there isn't, then there's nothing I can do. Anyways, I can't force you to buy or sell in broad daylight, right?" The girl smiled again. At that moment, the beauty of the girl hit him in the face, like the clear sky after a storm. There was a refreshing atmosphere. "I want to buy some Jianghu." Lu Qin nodded and said, "Jianghu, wait, let me see if there is any." "Okay." The girl smiled. Lu Qin searched the shelves and finally found this relatively common spirit material in a shelf. He put it on the counter and said, "There really is. If it was anything else, I wouldn't give it to you. But this spirit material, Jianghu, is taken from the seed. There is a hard shell on the outside and it will not spoil after 10 years. You should be able to use it." The girl thought about it and nodded. "Yes, that is true. My master also said so. Alright then, I'll buy 10. Okay. Lucien picked out 10 sangjuzi that looked good. He found a cloth and wiped them clean. Then he wrapped them in paper and handed them to the girl. The girl smiled sweetly and took the paper bag. As she put it away, she reached into her pocket and said, "How much? Ah." Suddenly she exclaimed and her expression changed. It was as if she was stunned. Lucien looked at her and said, "What is it?" The girl's cheeks flushed red. Her skin looked white and rosy, adding to her beauty. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She said, I seem to have forgotten to bring money." "Oh, I see." Lucien sighed. This business was too difficult. There was hesitation on the girl's face. After a moment she said awkwardly to Lucien, "Uncle, I have an urgent need for this sangjuzi. Can I take it first? I will have someone send the money later." Halfway through her words, she suddenly found that Lucien was staring at her with a strange expression. She couldn't help but lower her voice. A moment later she couldn't help but ask, "Can't I?" Lucien coughed and didn't answer. He asked instead, "What did you call me just now?" The girl stilled and said, "Uncle, you are so old, you are the uncle of the shopkeeper here." "Okay." Lucien shook his head and then said seriously to the girl, "No, you cannot owe money for the goods." The girl was shocked. She seemed to want to say something, but her face seemed to become even redder. She said in a low voice, I am not that kind of person. I said I will return it, I will definitely return it." That grace of lowering her head was enough to intoxicate people without drinking. Her watery eyes were enough to make the world fall for her. Lucien shook his head and said, "You can't." The girl looked sadly at him and could only put the paper bag in her hand back on the counter. Then she turned and walked out. Just as she was about to reach the door, Lucien's voice suddenly came from behind her. Your money bag is gone." The girl's footsteps suddenly stopped. Looking back, she saw that Lucien had walked out from behind the counter. At the same time, he was holding a small red bag with a flower embroidered with gold thread. "I was wondering where the money bag went." The girl's beautiful eyes widened and she quickly walked over. She said with a giggle and then reached out to Lucien. Lucien let her grab the small bag, but he didn't let go. The girl pulled and was somewhat surprised. She looked at Lucien and said, "Uncle, why don't you let go?" Lucien said, "I can return the money bag to you, but you should also return that sangjuzi in your sleeve to me." As he spoke, he didn't look at the girl's suddenly stiff smile. He sighed and said, "Also, don't call me uncle. It sounds weird." Chapter 85. The girl tugged at the pouch twice, but found that Lucien's grip was exceptionally firm and she couldn't pull it back. After her expression changed, the gentleness and carefulness on her face suddenly disappeared, and was replaced by a kind of annoyance. With a snort, her other hand suddenly raised, and a paper bag actually flew out from her sleeve, smashing towards Lucien's face. Lucien reached out to catch it and casually grabbed it with his hand, then nodded and let go. The girl took a step back and first hid the small bag in her bosom, then looked up and down at Lucien, coldly snorted and said, "I can't tell, you actually know such despicable methods." Lucien laughed and said, "I used to rely on this to make a living." As he said that, his gaze fell on the girl's exceptionally beautiful face and he frowned, saying, "Little girl, since you have such a beautiful appearance, why can't you do anything? Do you really have to do this? Don't blame me for not warning you, these despicable people are not good. With your beautiful face, if you aren't careful, I'm afraid you'll be eaten alive." Oh. The girl didn't look old, only about 10 years old, but at this moment, after removing her disguise, her body suddenly had an additional mature aura. Her young face revealed a disdainful look and she looked at Lucien saying, "So, you are still a good person?" Lucien said, "I can't say that I'm a good person, but it's not bad to remind you. What do you think?" The girl sneered and said, "You're just saying it casually. Less nonsense. Do you have anything else? If not, I'm leaving." This swindler was actually so self-righteous, as if not stealing from Lucien but Lucien's fault. Lucien also couldn't help but laugh, but first, this girl was really too young, and second, her face was already very beautiful at such a young age. It really made people unable to harden their hearts to do anything. He immediately waved his hand and said, "You can leave anyway. Next time you're caught, I won't be so polite. This broken shop, I'm not just passing by, even if you pay me money I won't come again." The girl angrily shouted, then turned around and walked out of the door. The black dog next to her wagged its tail and came over, jumping enthusiastically beside the girl. The girl looked at the black dog and especially saw the lame Atsu's hind legs. She was first startled, but then her eyes became slightly soft, and she reached out her hand to touch the head of the Atsu and said, "This dog is much cuter than your master." The Atsu tilted its head and stuck out its tongue and looked affectionate. Suddenly Lu Qin from behind and said, "Atsu, that's a bad guy, he wants to steal our things." The Atsu didn't seem to react for a moment, and blankly looked back at Lu Qin. Lu Qin sternly said, "Be fierce to her. Bite her." Atsu jumped up as if he had suddenly come to his senses. Immediately, the hair on his neck stood up, and he let out a low growl, baring his fangs at the young girl. He looked like a hungry wolf, ready to pounce and bite someone in the next moment. Ah! The girl was shocked and suddenly jumped away as if she was electrocuted. She quickly ran out of the door and then cursed at the shop, a house full of monsters, bad people and stupid dogs. Woof 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 woof. As the Atsu roared, it suddenly rushed out. The girl screamed and ran away. Her speed was extremely fast, and in the blink of an eye she ran out of the alley. The Atsu chased a step, but was stopped by Lu Qin from behind, and then turned back bitterly. But then it seemed to be happy again and quite proud. It circled around Lu Qin a few times and kept barking as if it wanted to take credit. Lu Qin sighed, looked at it, squatted down and grabbed the head of the Atsu in front of his eyes, pulled its ears and scratched the dog's fur. After looking left and right he frowned and said, "Strange, I remember that snow wolves and black jackals are intelligent and cunning monsters. Why do you always look stupid? Woof 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 woof." The Atsu stuck out half of its tongue and licked Lu Qin and looked very happy. In the evening old Ma came back. As soon as he entered the house, he pulled Lu Qin to close the door and went to the backyard. Then he said with a smile, "It's finally done." Lu Qin nodded and said, "That's good. When do we go up the mountain?" Old Ma said, "In 3 days. A few days ago the Kunlun party just held the annual Immortal Appraisal meeting, and they accepted a new batch of disciples. Recently, it's the time for those who have no chance to officially join the sect to display their supernatural powers. You're not conspicuous at all among them." Lu Qin looked at him and said with a smile, "What do you mean by displaying their supernatural powers?" Old Ma laughed and said in a low voice, "On the surface the Kunlun party wants to accept so many disciples, but in fact there are a lot of people who want to squeeze their own children into the sect. Don't tell me you don't know about this." Lu Qin shrugged and said, "From what you said, there are quite a lot of disciples like me who sneak into the sect in a roundabout way." Old Ma said with a smile, "Of course. The Immortal Appraisal meeting has accepted 500 people, and they can at least squeeze another 200 or 300 in." Damn. Lu Qin was shocked and said, "There are so many." Old Ma snorted and said, "The more they accept, the more spirit stones they can collect. This business is better than anything else." Lu Qin said with emotion, "You're right." At night 2 people and a dog sat in the small courtyard again. Old Ma took a sip of wine and said to Lu Qin with a frown, "You let that little girl go just like that?" Lu Qin said helplessly, "What else can I do? I can't really detain her, can I?" Old Ma thought for a while and said, "At least you should ask about her identity, background and name, right?" Lu Qin shook his head and said, "It's useless to ask. It's all fake." Old Ma clicked his tongue, and his eyes suddenly became a little strange. He looked at Lu Qin and said, "Speaking of which, why didn't I notice that you have this trick before? I didn't see you learn it from that person." Lu Qin smiled, picked up a cup of wine and lightly said, "That was before I met him. I was muddling around in this city trying to survive. Aside from picking up trash, I also learned how to steal and swindle people." Old Ma was stunned and looked at Lu Qin for a long time without saying anything. After a long time he said in a low voice, "It's not easy to be a lowly person. You were so young back then. Did you suffer a lot?" "Yes." Listening to Lu Qin's extremely simple answer, Old Ma didn't know what to say for a moment. After a while he laughed dryly and changed the topic and said, "Haha, that little girl is really unlucky. She happened to pass by here and wanted to do some business, but she actually met an expert. She must have been half dead with anger." "No." Lu Qin suddenly interrupted Old Ma. Old Ma was startled and said, "What's wrong?" Lu Qin smiled, and then he gazed at the cold and dark night sky in the distance. After that, he took a sip of wine and said, "All those years ago when I did all these things that harmed people, I'd always checked and calculated carefully, and there was no such thing as a coincidence. As for whether she happened to pass by, I don't know." Chapter 86. What should we do? Old Ma furrowed his brows in distress and said, "It feels a little troublesome." Lu Qin glanced at him and said, "Maybe they aren't here for me." Old Ma was stunned and said, "Then who are they here for?" Lu Qin looked at Old Ma's fat face and said seriously, "To be able to open a shop in such a desolate alley, he must be a fat sheep that is easily deceived. I think that's what that little girl is thinking." "Get lost." Old Ma scolded angrily and then took out a book as thick as a finger and threw it at him. Lu Qin caught it and flipped it open to take a look. At the same time he asked, "What is this?" Some of the most famous people in the Kunlun sect, the young geniuses of the younger generation, the children of the aristocratic families with deep backgrounds, and some people with eccentric temperament and behavior. Brief information about them, including Dao techniques, magical treasures and so on, are all written on it. In addition, there are also some situations in the Kunlun party's main halls. You can take a look when you have time. After you have written it down, burn this book. Lu Qin was silent for a long time. The joking expression on his face disappeared and he sat up straight. Then, with a serious expression, he said to Old Ma, "Thank you for your hard work." Old Ma grinned and said, "This kind of thing should be shown to people who understand. Only then will it be satisfying." Lu Qin sighed and said to him, "With this kind of ability, you can actually do a lot of big things. It's a bit of a disadvantage to hang around with people like me." Old Ma said, "In this world, is there anything bigger than what you want to do?" Lu Qin sneered and put away the book. Then he picked up the wine pot and poured wine for Old Ma and himself. At the same time he asked, "About the person we are looking for, what do you know?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "I have no clue. We do not know anything about that person, whether he is a man or a woman, whether he is old or young, whether his cultivation level is high or low. Other than knowing that he is hiding in the Kunlun party to do something big, we do not know anything else." Lu Qin raised his cup and clinked it with Old Ma's, then drained it in one gulp and said, "Take your time to find it." 3 days later, Lu Qin went to the Kunlun mountain and joined the Kunlun party, becoming a Kunlun disciple that was envied by most mortals. This was a layer of dazzling halo, like a gilded and dazzling coat, draped over his body. To outsiders, it looked so glorious except for the insiders who were also on Kunlun Mountain. Just as Old Ma had said before, although the Kunlun sect, which had a history of 5,000 years, usually paid the most attention to rules and integrity, after so many years, the persistence passed down by the founding master was still flexible. Apart from the 500 new disciples who were officially accepted during the Grand Immortal Appraisal meeting, Kunlun sect had secretly added another 250 people into the sect. Lu Qin was one of them. Unfortunately, his innate aptitude was considered to be the worst among all of them. In the cultivation world, talent and talent were based on the 5 elements wheel in the dantian of the Sea of Qi. The more divine pillars, the higher the talent. Generally speaking, only disciples who had at least 2 5 elements divine pillars would be accepted by famous sects like the Kunlun party. The hope of a first pillar disciple was too small, and the loss outweighed the gain by placing spiritual materials and resources on such a person. Yes, Lu Qin was the kind of person that the loss outweighed the gain, but this kind of person was not rare in the Kunlun mountain, because who did not have the dream of becoming an immortal? No matter how bad one's talent was, there was always a little hope. Besides, even if there was no hope of becoming an immortal, if one could get some opportunities in the Kunlun mountain and practice some magic, not only would one's strength increase greatly, one's life would also be extended a lot. Why not? This kind of thinking was naturally human nature. As for the high and mighty elders of the Kunlun sect, it was impossible for them to care about these small matters. Who didn't have a close relationship with someone? Furthermore, it wasn't like they were sent in for free. Therefore, in such a bright and slightly gray background, Lu Qin safely and calmly entered the Kunlun party, without attracting anyone's attention, and became a servant disciple with the lowest position in the Kunlun party. However, since he was of the lowest position, the Kunlun party would not keep idle people, so Lu Qin was quickly arranged to go to the Baichao Tang of the Kunlun party, and like the many other servant disciples, he grew all kinds of spiritual herbs for the Kunlun party. The majestic Kunlun was the first famous mountain in the western land. From a distance, one could only see the majestic peaks rising and falling, and the clouds were like waves. In the deepest part of the huge mountain range, the clouds gathered like a vast ocean, and as far as the eye could see, one could vaguely see the 4 faintly discernible figures of strange peaks floating high above the clouds. Could be said to be a magical place that seized all the creation of heaven and earth. However, this kind of immortal spiritual land historically Only the most elite part of the Kunlun party could set foot in it. Ordinary servant disciples did not even have the qualification to go near it. In the blink of an eye, Lu Qin had already entered the Kunlun party for a month. Over the past month he was no different from the people around him. Everyone woke up early and slept late every day, working hard for the spiritual herbs in the Kunlun immortal family's spiritual fields, hoping that one day they could get a lucky chance and stand out from the crowd. There were many servant disciples in the Kunlun party. It was said that among the 100,000 disciples, perhaps 60 to 70,000 were such people. To some extent, it was the hard work of the countless common people at the foot of the mountain and the many servant disciples on the mountain that supported a small part of the elites of the Kunlun party. As for the Baichao Tang, after Lu Qin came here, he was given a spiritual field of 1 mu, so that he could plant spiritual herbs. Every time it was harvest time he had to hand in a fixed amount of harvest, and then he would be considered to have completed his task. If he did not hand in enough he would be punished, and if he had an extra harvest he would be rewarded. Most of the servant disciples relied on these extra harvests that they had worked hard to obtain in exchange for a little hope of standing out in the future. Hope was the most beautiful thing, was it not? For most people it was, but for Lu Qin it was not. He quietly lived in the Kunlun party, and then quietly observed the giant Kunlun party in the shadows of the crowd. After slowly familiarizing himself with the situation here, he also began to touch the things he wanted little by little. Of course, that mysterious devil cult spy was still nowhere to be found. But in this month, Lu Qin had already learned some things. For example, the 2 supremes of the Kunlun party, Hakushin Jinkuan, was in closed-door training on the mountain peak among the clouds all year round, while Supremes Tianlan went to the immortal city of Zhangxianmeng, and seemed to be very busy. This year the Kunlun party had accepted more than 700 new disciples. Fortunately there were many talented newcomers, but those were phoenixes that flew up the branches, and had almost no interaction with sparrows like Lu Qin. And Hong Chuan, whom he had met before, had indeed left the Kunlun mountain a few days ago. It was said that he had gone to the distant northern region to hone his state of mind and cultivation. When Lu Qin heard the news he sighed for that friend in his heart. But very soon he thought that he would be very quiet and would be dormant for a very long time in the Kunlun mountain, but suddenly there were waves. It was one afternoon a month after he went up the mountain. At the edge of the forest where his spiritual field was located, he once again saw a familiar person coming out of the forest. It was Exian. That day, Exian's face seemed a little pale. Although her face was still so beautiful, she seemed to be a little absent-minded and did not notice that among the many servant disciples working in the spiritual field not far away, there was Lu Qin. Lu Qin quietly turned around, thinking that Kunlun mountain was so big, if he missed it today he might as well not see it again in the future. Trouble. Then he suddenly heard a scream coming from behind. The voice was sharp, and for some reason, it suddenly reminded him of the journey in the land of chaos. Lu Qin shook his head and sighed, thinking that it was troublesome. Chapter 87. Lu Qin's initial reaction was to turn around and leave. He was prepared to quietly avoid her. After all, Kunlun mountain was so big and Exian did not seem to have seen him. If he missed this chance he might not see her again in the future. But the scream that followed was indeed a little frightening. It was as if Exian had suddenly seen the most terrifying thing in the world. Her scream was heart-wrenching. Lu Qin stopped in his tracks, feeling a little helpless. At that moment, his mind replayed the journey with Exian in the land of chaos from beginning to end. He muttered, "It can't be. I don't remember doing anything to you. Are you so afraid to see me?" But when he turned his head to look in the direction of Exian, he suddenly frowned. He saw that when Exian walked out of the forest, a figure suddenly ran out from behind her and grabbed her hand. When the figure that appeared from behind appeared in everyone's line of sight, it immediately caused a commotion among the crowd of odd-job disciples who had slowly gathered to watch the show. Even the usually calm Lu Qin's expression changed slightly. At the same time he instantly understood why Exian would let out such a tragic scream. It was a man wearing the Kunlun party disciple uniform. But his face was completely destroyed. At least a dozen shocking scars remained on his face. His facial features were terrible. One of his ears was missing, his nose was gone, and there was a big cut on his chin. A terrible scar had slashed across his left eye, leaving a pitted red flesh. It seemed that this eyeball had also been destroyed. This face looked like it had been slashed countless times by a sharp blade, or had been ruthlessly gnawed on by a terrifying beast. It was completely devoid of human form. It was hard to imagine that a person who had suffered such serious injuries could actually survive that disaster. At this moment, it was a bright and sunny day. Under the bright sky, the surrounding people all felt a trace of coldness, and a few timid female disciples even closed their eyes and looked away, not daring to look directly at that person. The terrifying face that resembled a demon from hell suddenly appeared behind EXN. After grabbing her, the face leaned in and let out a deep, furious growl. When she lifted her eyes, the face was already inches away from her. No wonder she let out such a shrill scream. "Let me go. Let me go." However, to Lu Chen's surprise, EXN did not faint from fright. Instead, she screamed in horror and struggled with all her might, trying to break free from the monstrous man's grasp. At the same time she cried out repeatedly, "Shut up." The man with the terrifying face let out a low roar, but that did not calm EXN down. Instead she struggled even more intensely. This scene was seen by the surrounding people and there was a sudden uproar. A beautiful girl was being bullied by such a monster. No one could stand it. Suddenly 7 or 8 people from the side came over and shouted to stop it. Lu Chen also took 2 steps forward. No matter what, he had some friendship with EXIN. At the same time he also had some doubts in his heart. After joining the Kunlun party for a month, he had gradually learned a little about this famous sect. Although it was not as perfect as the legend said, the Kunlun party was still a place that followed rules. In general, it was impossible for there to be any public bullying on the Kunlun mountain. However, the scene in front of him was obviously not right. Just when Lu Chen was hesitating whether he should go forward to help, he suddenly heard EXIN's voice crying, "Let go, Senior He. I beg you, don't do this." Lu Chen's body trembled. He immediately focused his attention and looked towards that man. As expected, when he looked carefully, he could vaguely make out a little of that handsome Kunlun disciple's appearance that he had met in Crescent City that day from that little bit of residual outline. Figa. Didn't he already die on the Black Armor Mountain in the Land of Chaos? On that day, the scene of a large group of terrible black jackals swarming on the Black Armor Mountain was still fresh in Lu Chen's memory. Then, when he looked at He Gang's face again, those clear and terrifying scars that seemed to have been left behind by sharp claws and terrifying beast teeth, Lu Chen couldn't help but feel a slight chill in his heart. EXIN was crying and shouting in panic. The odd-job disciples next to her obviously did not know He Gang, so they surrounded him with righteous indignation. But He Gang also seemed to be very emotional and strange. Under the crowd's gaze, he did not have the slightest intention of retreating, and even glared at the people around him with terrible anger. Seeing that the scene suddenly became tense and on the verge of breaking out, suddenly, a loud shout came from behind the crowd. "Stop, what do you want?" This shout was full of momentum and the tone was loud, instantly suppressing all the other voices. After a moment, a tall man walked quickly to the center. He first glanced at He Gang and EXIN, and his face slightly darkened, but he did not lose his temper. Then he turned to look at the crowd around him, frowned and said in a deep voice, "Back off. What are you doing here? Do you want to rebel?" Lu Chen stood in the crowd and glanced at this person. Seeing that he had thick eyebrows and a square face, he was a disciple of the Kunlun party's Bai Chao Tang, who was sent to manage the spiritual field. His name was Zhou Kuei. After all, almost all the odd-job disciples were newcomers who knew nothing about cultivation, and planting spiritual fields still needed some tricks, so Bai Chao Tang would often send some disciples down. About every 100 odd-job disciples would have an official disciple in charge, and at the same time, they would teach the tricks of planting and some of the most basic cultivation methods. Zhou Kuei was such a person. Those who could get such a job were basically in the foundation realm, so in the Kunlun party, he could also be regarded as an elite disciple who had reached a higher level. Usually the odd-job disciples naturally respected Zhou Kuei very much. Although they only called him senior brother, in reality, his position was like a teacher and a father, and they did not dare to disobey him easily. But today's scene was really infuriating, and a bold person in the crowd shouted loudly, "Senior brother Zhou, it's not that we want to cause trouble, but that person is bullying our junior sister in broad daylight." Zhou Kuei's face was as dark as water. He slowly turned around and glanced at He Gang's hand that was still tightly gripping EXIN's wrist. He snorted and said, "Junior brother He, you're not doing this right?" Facing this Bai Chao Tang disciple Zhou Kuei, whose cultivation was in the foundation realm, He Gang's imposing manner was obviously weaker, but he still raised his head and shouted through gritted teeth, I didn't do anything, I just wanted to chat with junior sister E. What did I do wrong? Zhou Kuei's gaze fell on Exion's pretty but tear-stained face. A trace of sympathy seemed to flash across his eyes, but he still sighed and said, Junior sister E, is it like this? Exion struggled with all her might, perhaps because Zhou Kuei was right beside her. Gang finally did not dare to use force anymore, letting her withdraw her arm, but there was already an obvious red mark on her wrist. Then Exion glanced at Zhou Kuei, a complicated expression flashed across her face, like fear, regret, and also like she was at a loss. In the end, she slowly lowered her head and softly replied, yes. The odd-job disciples in the crowd immediately burst into an uproar. Everyone had a look of surprise on their faces, and Lu Qin in the crowd frowned, looking deeply at Exin. Chapter 88. The wide spiritual field that everyone was currently in was actually a flat and wide valley in the Kunlun mountain range. It was surrounded by mountains, and in the middle was a rare expanse of flat land that was rich in spiritual energy and fertile. It was a very important production area for the Kunlun party's Baichao Tang. Due to the fact that the largest mountain next to it was the Rock Mountain, this valley basin was named the Rock Mountain Valley. At this moment, the warm sunlight shone down from the sky, shining on Rock Valley. The mountain wind blew through the valley from the forest, and countless spiritual plants danced in the wind, like a magnificent wave. At the edge of the forest at the foot of Rock Mountain, the atmosphere was cold and strange. Many servant disciples gathered there, looking at the young girl with her head lowered in disbelief. Exion's panicked crying didn't seem like she was just chatting in the forest. She was obviously frightened. But in the end, the victim herself said that she was fine, so what else could they do? Zhou Kuei reacted quickly. He turned around and shouted at the servant disciples, okay. Didn't you see that junior sister E said that she was fine? What are you still doing here? Go back to work. Many janitor disciples looked at each other in dismay. Most of the new disciples were young and full of vigor. However, everyone knew that there might be some inside story behind this situation. So, under the whispers and strange gazes, the crowd slowly dispersed. After Zhou Kuei dispersed the crowd, he frowned at Gang and Exn at the edge of the forest. He wanted to turn around and leave with a straight face. Who knew that at this time Exn suddenly ran a few steps towards him and said, Senior brother Zhou, I'll go with you. Zhou Kuei's body trembled slightly. Before he could say anything, Gang, who was behind him, already said loudly, Junior sister E, I still have something to say to you. Exn didn't even look at him. She looked at Zhou Kuei with pleading eyes. Zhou Kuei was silent for a moment, then nodded his head and said to Exin, okay. Exin immediately looked happy and nodded. Gang was shocked. Senior brother Zhou, what are you doing? Zhou Kuei's eyes flashed with a trace of impatience. He turned to look at Gang and frowned. Junior brother everything should be done in moderation. Besides, junior sister E has something to do with me. Are you trying to discipline me? Gang subconsciously flinched under Zhou Kuei's piercing stare. After a moment, he seemed to grit his teeth and glanced fiercely at Exin, then turned around and left without a word. As Exin watched Gang leave, she finally heaved a sigh of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Zhou Kuei saw her expression and his eyes softened. He asked softly, Are you all right? Are you all right? Exin nodded silently. Zhou Kuei said, Let's go. He walked forward. Exn silently followed beside him, but after walking for a while she suddenly heard Zhou Kuei's voice. Junior sister E, you still have to think of a solution for this matter yourself. Exn raised her head to look at Zhou Kuei in a daze, only to see that Zhou Kuei was not looking at her. Instead he was looking straight ahead, but he said in a voice that only she could hear, I have known Senior He for many years, and I know that his talent are extraordinary. Now that he is about to break through to the Golden Elixir realm, at his age, his future can be said to be limitless. He turned around with a sympathetic expression mixed with some helplessness. It doesn't matter if I help you once in a while. Senior brother He will probably just smile when he hears it. But if I help him again and again, I'm afraid he won't like it. Do you understand? Exion's face turned pale. After a while, she lowered her head and said in a low voice, I understand. At this moment she seemed to be in a daze. Her face was as pale as paper. She seemed to be trapped in some kind of fear for the future, so much so that she didn't notice that in a spiritual field not far from them, Lu Qin was standing there thoughtfully looking at her figure. The Kunlun party was a famous sect with many rules. But after so many years, it wasn't that it didn't care about human feelings. Living in the mountains was hard and cultivating was boring, so the sect didn't strictly forbid its disciples from leaving the mountain. Generally speaking, even if it was a part-time disciple, as long as he could guarantee to come back before the curfew, the Kunlun party's mountain gate guards wouldn't stop him. However, it was precisely because of the curfew that anyone who violated it would be severely punished. Therefore, unless they received orders from the sect to go out, most people could only stroll in Kunwa City at the foot of the mountain. However, the Kunlun mountain range was very vast. Generally, the disciples who were assigned to cultivate or work on the mountains far away from the mountain gate of the southern foothills would need several hours to reach the mountain gate if they didn't have the ability to fly fast. In fact, they wouldn't be able to go down the mountain. The Shirpan Valley where Luchin lived was about 2 hours away from the mountain gate of the southern foothills. It wasn't far, but it wasn't close either. As long as he could squeeze out some time, he could go to Kunwa City for a stroll. In Kunwa City, the fatty old Ma's Black Hill Pavilion was naturally the place he often went to. The remote and quiet alley was as deep and serene as before. It seemed that no matter how many years passed, there wouldn't be a single customer. Old Ma sat on the threshold with a somewhat sad expression. He sighed and said, "Alas, when will there be any business? Don't think about it." Sitting behind the counter in the room, Luchin yawned lazily and said, "Just give up. You're not cut out to do business." Old Ma spat and said indignantly, "Bullshit. Your father was born to be a genius. In the future I'll definitely do something big and earn a fortune that can rival a country. At that time you can just wait to kneel in front of me." Luchin said, "Wake up. It's not dark yet. Stop dreaming." Old Ma muttered. He probably felt that it was really inappropriate to talk about ideals with this person, so he said, "You've been on the mountain for a month now. How's the situation?" Luchin shrugged and said, "In the beginning I couldn't say anything. However, this Kunlun party really has a lot of rules. It's a 5,000-year famous sect. It's not strange," Old Ma said with a smile. Then he glanced at the empty alley outside and said, "By the way, I found the person you asked me to investigate last time." Luchin raised his eyebrows and looked over. He said, You actually found him. I've underestimated you." Old Horse had a smug look on his face as he said, "Nonsense. Who do you think I am? As long as I want to investigate, there's nothing on this Kunlun mountain that I can't figure out." Luchin was too lazy to care about this guy's bragging. He just asked, "Who is that person?" Old Ma said, "Moonlight cut is extremely difficult to practice. There are not many young disciples who can practice it. Moreover, it's a woman. Moreover, during that period of time she was not on the mountain of Kunlun. After searching for a long time, there's probably only one person left. Su Qingjun, the only disciple of the Kunlun party's Masato Kihara." Chapter 89. Muyuan. Luchin frowned slightly. After pondering for a moment, he asked with a strange look in his eyes, "The one from the Tieji branch?" Old Ma nodded and said, "That's right. That old man is one of the 4 Yuanying Jinren of the Tieji branch of the Kunlun party. He's also recognized as the strongest in Taoism and divine powers. It's not an exaggeration to say that he's the leader of the Tieji branch." Luchin nodded and said, "What about Su Qingjun herself?" Old Ma said, "She's very outstanding. She's extremely talented. It's said that she's one of the top 4 pillars. She can be said to be very gifted. Her progress in Taoism is very fast and she's worthy of the word genius. She's only 22 years old, but she's already at the peak of the foundational state. Among the young foundational state disciples of the Kunlun party, there are about a dozen of them who've reached the peak of the Jindan state and are only one step away. But the most famous ones are Su Qingjun, He, Song Huaisong and Feng Yu." At this point Old Ma paused and looked at Luchin. "At such a young age you are only one step away from the Golden Core realm. With this kind of strength and talent, the difference between you and an ordinary Foundation realm disciple is like heaven and earth. I don't need to say more, right?" Luchin smiled and said, "If she's lucky enough, she might have a chance to peek into the Yuanying state in the future." "Yes, becoming a Jinren?" Old Ma sighed with some emotion. He then said to Luchin seriously, "Since you know it, don't think too much, okay? That girl has no grudge against you. She didn't really hurt you in the land of chaos. You don't have to go against such a proud girl, do you?" Luchin's expression didn't change. It seemed that he didn't take this matter to heart. He said casually, I don't plan to do anything to her. I'm just curious. Old Ma stared at him for a moment, then snorted and said, That's not necessarily the case. You're full of evil tricks, sinister and cunning. Who knows what you'll do later? Let me tell you, although Kunlun's iron branch is weak, there are still 4 Yuanying Jinren sitting there. A genius disciple like Su Qingjun would have a limitless future. Taiji would definitely protect her like a precious treasure. Don't look for trouble. But Lu Qin spat and said, I came to Kunlun Mountain for the sake of the common people of the world, the righteous path of life, yet I had no choice but to risk my own safety to do such a dangerous thing. Why do you, this servant, always regard me as someone who is worse than the devil cult? Old Ma said seriously, You're right, that's the truth. As he said this, he suddenly lowered his head to avoid a stool that flew towards him. Then he looked around and smiled, Oh yes, where's Atsu? Why don't I see it? I just brought a bag of meat bones for it. It's chewing on it in the backyard. Lu Qin said. This black dog's appetite seems to be very big. It's eating me poor. Hurry up and bring it up the mountain. Wait for another 2 months. I'm not familiar with it yet. Lu Qin said casually, Oh yes, there's one more thing. Help me check it out. It's about the girl from the Yi family I told you about last time. As he said this, Lu Qin told Old Ma about the scene he saw at the spiritual field in Shirpan Valley. In the end he frowned and said, He gang didn't die. And looking at Exan, she seems to be afraid of him. I'm afraid there's something strange about it. Okay, leave it to me, Old Ma said with a smile. Lu Qin stood up, looked at the sky and said, All right, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I'm going back to the mountain. Old Ma nodded and watched as Lu Qin walked to the door. Just as he was about to step over the threshold, Old Ma suddenly said, There's something you might not know. This year, the Kunlun Party's Immortal Appraisal Conference had a great harvest. The Kunlun Party had recruited many talented 3 pillars and even 4 pillars. However, there's one thing that the Kunlun Party suppressed. Lu Qin's body trembled slightly. He turned to look at Old Ma. Old Ma looked straight into his eyes. For some reason, there was a complicated and incomprehensible light in his eyes. He said softly, I heard that during the conference they found a rare 1-in-a-million peerless genius. That person had all 5 elements and there were 5 pillars on the Sea of Qi. Lu Qin's expression changed slightly. It seemed that even a calm person like him was startled after hearing about this matter. But very quickly, a trace of a smile appeared on his face. A self-deprecating smile appeared on his face. Amazing, a 5 pillars genius. He murmured, then raised his head to look at the sky. He said lightly, Just like me, isn't it? Old Ma was silent. It was already evening when he returned to the mountain. When Lu Qin walked through the mountain gate and walked along the mountain path to his residence at the foot of Shirpan Mountain, the sky gradually darkened. Night came. At night, Kunlun Mountain was still majestic, but it was less majestic than during the day and more distant and deep in the night. Each mountain peak was like a silent giant, quietly standing in the darkness, quietly watching Lu Qin walk between the mountains. Unknowingly, there was no one else on the mountain path. Only Lu Qin walked alone. The night was somewhat desolate, and the mountain wind was somewhat cold. It whistled past and the faint starlight shone on the ground. One could see the swaying shadows, like dancing demons and ghosts. There was still some time before the curfew. Lu Qin looked at the night sky and expressionlessly walked on this dark road. Gradually, even he himself seemed to blend into it, becoming a part of those terrifying shadows. When it was too quiet, one's thoughts would spread out, making one's thoughts seem to be more than usual. As Lu Qin walked, he suddenly thought of the small village that he had lived in for 10 years, and the beautiful girl who was already sleeping by the Dragon Lake on Tea Mountain. At this time, would there be a cold wind blowing by the Dragon Lake? Maybe she would also feel a little cold because she was afraid of the cold before. Lu Qin suddenly shook his head, freeing himself from these thoughts, and then continued walking. The night was still cold, and then he thought of the day before they parted, the strange look in Old Ma's eyes when he looked at him. Lu Qin knew what Old Ma meant. Although that fatty was not a good person, but for so many years he was the person that he trusted the most. He knew that Old Ma meant well. Old Ma actually felt that it was not worth it for him and somewhat regretted it. However, some words could not be said to anyone, whether it was him or Old Ma, or perhaps everyone actually understood in their hearts. If it was not good enough, how could it be used as a successful bait? If it was not an exceptional talent, how would the evil sect elder, that kind of person, be interested in it? Sacrifice? Perhaps only that big fatty who was always hidden in the depths of the light, was the truly ruthless and ruthless person. The mountain breeze was faint, blowing past his clothes as if there was a bone-chilling cold. Lu Qin gently pulled his clothes, thinking that if there was a chance in the future, he should go back to the Dragon Lake on Tea Mountain to take a look, add more soil for Ding Dong's grave, and plant more trees beside it. While he was thinking of this, Lu Qin's body suddenly stopped, his footsteps abruptly stopped. In the depths of the winding mountain path hidden in the dark shadows, in the deep darkness, a soft, trembling whimper suddenly came from an unknown place. In this desolate and cold night, it sounded like the weeping of a night ghost faintly coming over. The shadows of the surrounding tall mountains at this moment seemed to suddenly cover down, making this section of the mountain path seem especially dark. The night was deep, it was a desolate time. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.